In the vast collection of Sumerian cuneiform tablets housed within the British Museum, one peculiar pattern emerges that has puzzled Assyriologists since the late 19th century. Among the thousands of administrative records, religious hymns, and mythological narratives catalogued from ancient Mesopotamia, certain tablets contain deliberate textual omissions where divine names should appear. These gaps, identified through grammatical analysis and comparative textual studies, are not accidental damage or scribal errors. They represent intentional suppressions of a specific deity, whose very name appears to have been considered too dangerous to write. The phenomenon becomes particularly apparent in Tablet K 3741, discovered during Austin Henry Layard's excavations at Nineveh between 1845 and 1851. This fragment, part of a larger mythological series, contains a narrative describing conflicts among the Anunnaki pantheon. At crucial points where divine names would normally appear, the cuneiform text employs euphemistic phrases such as the one whose name brings darkness, or he who must not be invoked. The consistency of these substitutions across multiple independent tablet sources suggests a systematic pattern of name suppression that extended across centuries of Mesopotamian scribal tradition. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes at Nippur, Uruk, and Eridu reveals that this naming prohibition was not merely literary convention, but carried severe practical consequences for those who violated the taboo. Excavations conducted by the University of Pennsylvania between 1888 and 1900 uncovered sealed chambers containing tablets that describe punishments inflicted upon priests who spoke the forbidden name during ritual ceremonies. These accounts, written in administrative language rather than mythological narrative, provide disturbing details about psychological deterioration, physical afflictions, and deaths that followed violations of the naming prohibition. The evidence we are about to examine draws from multiple domains, including textual analysis of cuneiform sources, archaeological discoveries from Mesopotamian temple sites, comparative mythology across ancient Near Eastern cultures, and linguistic studies that reveal the hidden identity of this unnamed deity and the metaphysical principles that made speaking the name so dangerous. The systematic analysis of Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets reveals a consistent pattern of textual suppression that extends across different periods, geographical locations, and scribal traditions. Tablet catalogues from the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin contain hundreds of texts where specific divine references have been intentionally omitted or replaced with euphemistic phrases. The grammatical structure of Sumerian and Akkadian languages requires specific case markers and determinatives when referencing deities, creating syntactical frameworks that make omissions immediately apparent to trained scholars. In texts where these grammatical structures appear without corresponding divine names, the gaps stand out as obvious intentional suppressions rather than scribal errors or physical damage. The most comprehensive catalogue of these omissions was compiled by German Assyriologist Anton Demel during his systematic analysis of Sumerian temple archives between 1914 and 1934. Demel identified over 270 instances across multiple text types where the grammatical evidence indicated deliberate name suppression. His research, published in the Analecta Orientalia series, demonstrated that these omissions followed consistent patterns that correlated with specific mythological contexts involving primordial chaos, forbidden knowledge, and catastrophic divine conflicts. The Sumerian language employed a determinative sign called dingir, represented by an 8-pointed star symbol, that always preceded divine names in cuneiform writing. This determinative functioned as a grammatical marker indicating that the following word represented a deity or divine entity. When texts contain this dingir determinative followed by blank space or obvious erasure, the intentional nature of the suppression becomes undeniable. Tablet M54312 from the Iraq Museum in Baghdad provides one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. This administrative text from Girsu dating to approximately 2200 BC contains a list of offerings made to various deities during a specific festival cycle. The tablet methodically records offerings to Enlil, Ninlil, Inanna, Utu, and other members of the Mesopotamian pantheon, each name properly preceded by the dingir determinative. However, at one point in the sequence, the determinative appears followed by a space exactly large enough for a 3-sign divine name, after which the text continues with the standard offering quantities and descriptions. The physical condition of the tablet shows no damage at this location, the clay surface remains smooth and intact, indicating that the omission occurred during the original writing rather than through subsequent erasure or deterioration. The scribe deliberately left the space blank while maintaining all surrounding grammatical structures. The pattern repeats across hundreds of similar administrative documents from different sites and periods. Comparative analysis reveals that these gaps consistently appear in contexts involving primordial events, cosmic conflicts, or references to knowledge from before the establishment of current divine order. Religious hymns and mythological narratives show even more sophisticated suppression techniques. In these literary texts, scribes could not simply leave blank spaces without disrupting narrative flow, so they developed elaborate circumlocution strategies that referenced the unnamed deity through descriptions of actions, attributes, or effects, rather than direct naming. The text known as the Lament for Sumer and Ur, composed around 2000 BC, following the destruction of the Ur-3 dynasty, contains multiple instances where divine agency is described without corresponding divine identification. One passage describes how the foundations of the earth trembled when he who dwells in the sealed depth stirred in his bonds. The grammatical construction requires a divine name as the subject of the action, but instead the text provides only a descriptive phrase. This same descriptive phrase, he who dwells in the sealed depths, appears in texts from geographically separated sites including Nippur, Lhasa, and Babylon, spanning a period of over 800 years. The consistency of this specific phrase across such vast temporal and spatial distribution indicates standardized scribal training that included protocols for referring to the forbidden deity without naming it. French Assyriologist Jean Bottero, working with tablets from the Louvre collection during the 1960s and 70s, conducted statistical analysis of divine name frequencies in Mesopotamian religious texts. His research revealed that while major deities like Enlil, Enki, and Inanna appeared hundreds of times across the corpus with normal name usage, the euphemistic phrases for the unnamed deity appeared with comparable frequency, but never once accompanied by an actual divine name. This statistical anomaly confirmed that the suppression was systematic and deliberate rather than accidental. The grammatical evidence extends beyond simple name omission to include modification of standard theological formulas. Mesopotamian religious texts typically employed a formula structure when describing divine genealogies, listing a deity's name followed by parentage indicators such as son of or daughter of with the parent deity's name. Texts dealing with primordial cosmology occasionally contain these genealogical formulas where both the subject deity and the parent deity are suppressed, appearing as son of the one whose name brings darkness or offspring of the sealed one. These double suppressions created grammatical structures that were technically complete but informationally opaque, preserving narrative coherence while concealing dangerous knowledge. When Sumerian scribes could not avoid referencing the forbidden deity entirely, they employed a sophisticated system of euphemistic substitutions that concealed the true name while maintaining narrative coherence. These substitutions appear with remarkable consistency across geographically separated scribal centers, suggesting centralized protocols governing how the unnamed entity could be discussed. The most common euphemism appears as the Sumerian phrase Namba Andazu'u Ne, literally translating to the one who must not be known. This phrase appears in administrative texts from Lagash dating to approximately 2400 BC, religious hymns from Nippur from the Ur-3 period around 2100 BC, and mythological narratives from Babylon during the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC. The geographical and temporal distribution of this identical phrase indicates that naming prohibitions were not local customs, but represented empire-wide religious protocols maintained across centuries. Akkadian texts employed parallel substitutions including Shalanabu Ishu, meaning he whose utterance is forbidden, and Shazikru Galtu, translating as he whose name is fearful. The linguistic structure of these euphemisms reveals sophisticated theological understanding of the relationship between naming and metaphysical invocation. The Sumerian phrase Namba Andazu'uni employs the negative particle namba followed by the verbal form Andazu'une, creating a prohibitive construction that literally means he should not be made known. The grammatical mood indicates active prohibition rather than simple absence of knowledge, distinguishing the forbidden deity from merely forgotten or unknown entities. This linguistic precision appears consistently across multiple scribal traditions, indicating that the prohibition originated from centralized religious authority rather than evolving through folk tradition. Tablet Y BC 2177 from the Yale Babylonian collection contains a scribal training text from the Old Babylonian period that provides explicit instruction on proper euphemistic substitutions. This educational document, used for training apprentice scribes in advanced literary composition, includes a section titled Concerning the Names That Must Not Be Written. The text lists 15 different euphemistic phrases appropriate for different narrative contexts, each carefully distinguished by the specific theological or mythological situation being described. For references to the deity's role in primordial chaos, scribes should use the phrase the one from before separation. When describing the deity's imprisonment, the appropriate euphemism is the bound one beneath the foundations. References to the deity's dangerous knowledge require the phrase, the keeper of what must remain sealed. This scribal manual demonstrates that euphemistic substitution was not improvised by individual scribes, but followed standardized protocols taught through formal education systems. The consistency of these protocols across the Mesopotamian scribal tradition indicates active maintenance of the naming prohibition through institutional mechanisms. Temple archives from Nippur contain correspondence between scribal schools in different cities discussing proper handling of texts that contained references to the forbidden deity. One letter, designated Tablet CBS 16234, was sent from the Scribal Academy at Nippur to the Academy at Ur around 1900 BC. The letter addresses questions about appropriate euphemisms for a specific mythological context involving the deity's conflict with Enlil during the primordial organization of the cosmos. The Nippur scribes provide detailed guidance specifying that in this particular context the phrase the challenger of the appointed order is most theologically appropriate, as it emphasizes the deity's opposition to established cosmic hierarchy without invoking the dangerous associations of other euphemisms. This correspondence reveals that scribal communities actively debated and refined their euphemistic protocols to maintain theological precision while ensuring safety. The sophistication of the substitution system extended to creating contextual variations that preserved narrative detail while maintaining name suppression. Different euphemisms emphasized different aspects of the deity's nature, role, or circumstances depending on what the narrative required. When texts needed to reference the deity's association with subterranean waters, they used phrases like Lord of the Depths Beneath or Master of the Sealed Apsu. References to the deity's possession of forbidden knowledge employed euphemisms such as the one who knows what was before or keeper of the primordial wisdom. Descriptions of the deity's imprisonment used phrases including the bound one in darkness or he who is sealed beneath 7 gates. This variety of euphemisms enabled scribes to maintain narrative complexity and theological nuance while avoiding the dangerous direct naming. Analysis of these euphemistic patterns reveals theological distinctions that illuminate Mesopotamian understanding of divine nature and cosmic order. The deity required name suppression not because of inherent evil, but because of dangerous knowledge and primordial power that threatened the stability of the current cosmic arrangement. The euphemisms consistently emphasize themes of depth, darkness, sealing, and primordial time, locating the deity in spaces and periods that existed before the establishment of ordered creation. This theological framework distinguished the forbidden deity from demons or evil spirits, which could be named and thus controlled through proper ritual procedures. The unnamed deity represented something more fundamentally dangerous, a force so primordial and powerful that even linguistic invocation posed existential threat to cosmic order. Physical archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian temple sites confirms that name suppression extended beyond textual practices to include architectural and ritual protocols designed to prevent accidental invocation. Excavations at the Eka temple complex in Nippur, conducted by the University of Pennsylvania expeditions between 1888 and 1900, uncovered specialized chambers that appear designed for containing knowledge about the forbidden deity while preventing its transmission. These chambers, located in the deepest subterranean levels of the temple complex, were sealed with unusual architectural features, including double walls with bitumen barriers, ventilation systems that could be completely closed, and entrance configurations that required multiple priests to operate simultaneously. The chambers contained tablets describing the unnamed deity, stored in sealed clay containers marked with warning inscriptions. One particularly significant chamber, designated Chamber 17 in the excavation records, contained 43 tablets arranged in a specific sequence that required reading in precise order to maintain safety protocols. The architectural features of these sealed chambers demonstrate engineering sophistication that exceeded normal Mesopotamian construction practices. Chamber 17 was located approximately 15 meters below the temple's ground level, accessed through a descending corridor that incorporated 3 separate ceiling points. Each ceiling point consisted of massive cedar doors reinforced with bronze fittings, behind which workers had installed stone plugs weighing approximately 2 tons each. The plugs were carved from basalt quarried from sources over 300 kilometers distant, suggesting that the effort and expense of creating these barriers reflected genuine concern about containment rather than mere symbolic ritual precaution. The chamber walls were constructed using a double wall technique with a 1-meter gap between inner and outer walls. This gap was filled with alternating layers of bitumen and crushed brick, creating a barrier approximately 1 meter thick that surrounded the chamber on all sides, including floor and ceiling. Chemical analysis of the bitumen conducted by the University of Pennsylvania team revealed that it contained additives including sulfur compounds and aromatic resins that were not standard components of normal Mesopotamian waterproofing mixtures. These additives suggest the barriers were designed to block more than physical intrusion or water seepage, possibly intended to prevent some form of energetic or spiritual contamination from escaping the sealed space. The ventilation system incorporated into Chamber 17 showed unusual design features that enabled complete atmospheric isolation when necessary. Bronze-fitted air shafts connected the chamber to the surface through channels that zigzagged rather than running straight, with each change in direction incorporating a valve mechanism that could seal the shaft. When all valves were closed, the chamber became completely isolated from external atmosphere. The complexity of this system far exceeded requirements for simple air circulation, suggesting it was designed to prevent contamination of the temple's upper levels by whatever was contained below. Excavators discovered the valve mechanisms in closed position when the chamber was first accessed, indicating that the chamber had been deliberately sealed during its final use. Similar architectural features appear at other major Mesopotamian temple sites, suggesting standardized approaches to containing dangerous knowledge. Excavations at the Asagala temple complex in Babylon, conducted by German archaeologist Robert Koldewey between 1899 and 1917, uncovered subterranean chambers with identical double-wall construction, sealed ventilation systems, and massive stone plugs blocking access corridors. The consistency of these features across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and constructed during different historical periods indicates that protocols for dangerous knowledge containment were maintained through centralized religious authorities and transmitted across generations of temple architects. The positioning of these sealed chambers within temple complexes followed consistent patterns that reveal theological principles underlying their construction. The chambers were invariably located at the deepest accessible point beneath the temple structure, typically directly below the temple's central shrine or Holy of Holies. This positioning created vertical alignment between the surface location, where the primary deity received worship, and the subterranean location, where dangerous primordial knowledge was contained. The architectural arrangement suggests theological understanding of cosmic layering, with ordered divine worship occurring at the surface level while chaotic, primordial forces remained sealed beneath. Protective inscriptions carved into the stone plugs and door frames of these sealed chambers provide textual confirmation of their purpose. The entrance to Chamber 17 at Nippur bore an inscription in archaic Sumerian stating, "Beyond this seal lies knowledge from before the separation of heaven and earth, to be accessed only by the appointed guardians in times of dire need, with all protections observed." Similar inscriptions at other sites warn of the consequences of improper access, describing spiritual contamination, madness, and death as results of violating the sealing protocols. The consistency and specificity of these warnings across multiple sites indicate they were based on actual experiences rather than theoretical dangers. The tablets discovered in Chamber 17 at Nippur include one designated CBS, 19,847 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum catalogue, that functions as a metatextual warning about the dangers of accessing the forbidden knowledge contained in the surrounding documents. This tablet, written in archaic Sumerian with Akkadian glosses, provides explicit instructions for priests who must handle texts containing references to the unnamed deity. The document describes ritual purification requirements, including 40 days of fasting, specific astronomical timing windows when the text could be safely accessed, and protective incantations that must be recited before and after reading. Most significantly, the tablet provides detailed descriptions of symptoms that afflicted individuals who violated these protocols. The symptoms begin with auditory phenomena described as whispers from the depths that start 3 days after improper exposure. These whispers intensify over a 7-day period, during which affected individuals report hearing voices speaking in unknown languages and experiencing vivid nightmares involving primordial chaos and cosmic dissolution. The text of CBS 19847 occupies both obverse and reverse surfaces of a large tablet measuring approximately 30 centimeters by 20 centimeters, substantially larger than typical administrative documents but consistent with important religious or ritual texts. The writing employs an archaic form of cuneiform script that dates the composition to approximately 2200 BC, though the tablet itself is a later copy made around 1800 BC during the Old Babylonian period. The presence of Akkadian glosses indicating pronunciation and meaning of Sumerian terms suggests the text was copied and maintained, even as Sumerian was becoming a scholarly rather than spoken language, indicating the enduring importance of these safety protocols. The purification requirements described in the tablet demonstrate sophisticated understanding of ritual preparation necessary for safely accessing dangerous knowledge. The 40-day fasting period required consumption only of barley bread and water, with complete abstinence from meat, wine, and all luxuries. During this period, the priest must remain within the temple complex boundaries, avoiding contact with corpses, menstruating women, and anyone who had recently experienced childbirth. These restrictions created a state of ritual purity that Mesopotamian religious thought considered necessary for approaching the divine realm without suffering harm. The specificity of the 40-day duration appears in multiple contexts throughout ancient Near Eastern ritual practice, suggesting this period represented a recognized threshold for achieving transformative purification. The astronomical timing requirements add another layer of complexity to the access protocols. The tablet specifies that texts about the unnamed deity could only be safely accessed during specific lunar phases when the moon was in conjunction with particular stellar configurations. The text states that reading must occur only when the moon stands in the house of darkness, and the 7 judges are visible in the depths of heaven. Astronomical analysis of these descriptions by scholars including Alexander Heidel and Francesca Rochberg indicates this refers to new moon periods when specific star groups associated with the underworld deities known as the Anunnaki judges were rising. These timing restrictions limited access to perhaps 3 or 4 days per month under optimal conditions, and some astronomical configurations occurred only once every several years. The protective incantations specified in the tablet show sophisticated understanding of linguistic formulas designed to create metaphysical barriers against contamination. The primary protective incantation invoked Enki, Marduk, and Shamash as guardians against the rising darkness, requesting their presence and protection during the dangerous act of accessing forbidden knowledge. The incantation text specifies exact wording that must not be altered or abbreviated, indicating that Mesopotamian religious thought understood certain linguistic formulas as possessing intrinsic power rather than merely symbolic significance. The incantation must be recited 7 times before opening the sealed containers, holding the dangerous tablets, and 7 times after reading concluded, creating a ritual frame that contained the dangerous knowledge within protective boundaries. The symptom descriptions provided in the warning tablet demonstrate that Mesopotamian priests based their safety protocols on observed consequences of violations, rather than abstract theological speculation. The text describes a specific progression of afflictions beginning with auditory phenomena occurring 3 days after improper exposure. These whispers from the depths started as barely perceptible sounds at the edge of hearing, but intensified over subsequent days until they became constant intrusive voices. The voices spoke in languages the afflicted individuals did not understand, described as the tongue from before Babel, or the speech of the first waters. Multiple independent texts from different sites and periods describe these same auditory symptoms using nearly identical terminology, suggesting they documented real reported experiences rather than literary invention. The nightmares associated with contamination showed consistent content across different cases, documented in various texts. Afflicted individuals dreamed of descending through layers of earth into increasingly dark and chaotic spaces where the normal laws of reality no longer functioned. The dreams included encounters with primordial beings described as formless and terrible, existing in states between being and non-being. These dream experiences caused profound psychological distress that persisted even after the individual awakened, creating a sense of contamination that could not be washed away through normal purification rituals. The detailed documentation of these symptoms across multiple independent sources lends credibility to the assertion that accessing forbidden knowledge produced genuine psychological effects that Mesopotamian priests interpreted through their theological framework of divine contamination and metaphysical danger. Mesopotamian medical compendia contain specific diagnostic categories for afflictions that resulted from speaking the forbidden name or improperly accessing texts about the unnamed deity. The diagnostic series known as the SAGIG, preserved in copies from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh dating to the 7th century BC but based on much earlier Babylonian sources, includes a section describing the disease of the forbidden utterance. Tablet BM 47451 from the British Museum collection provides the most detailed symptomology. The text describes initial symptoms including persistent ringing in the ears characterized as the sound of bronze bells from the abyss, visual disturbances involving peripheral shadows that move against light sources, and skin sensations described as the touch of cold fingers from beneath the earth. These initial symptoms typically manifest within 3 to 7 days of the naming violation. The progression continues with psychological symptoms including obsessive thoughts about underground spaces, compulsive drawing of spiral patterns, and recurring nightmares involving descent into subterranean chambers. The medical framework applied to these afflictions reveals sophisticated Mesopotamian understanding of disease causation that distinguished between natural illnesses and conditions resulting from supernatural contamination. The SAGIG diagnostic series organized diseases according to their presumed origins, with separate sections for conditions caused by divine anger, demonic possession, sorcery, and contact with forbidden knowledge. The afflictions resulting from speaking the forbidden name occupied a unique category, distinct from all other supernatural disease etiologies. Unlike illnesses attributed to demonic possession, which could be treated through exorcism rituals, or conditions caused by divine anger, which required appeasement offerings, the disease of the forbidden utterance had no reliable cure. Medical texts state that once contamination reached advanced stages, the afflicted individual could not be saved through any known ritual or pharmaceutical intervention. The symptom progression documented in BM 47451 follows a predictable pattern that enabled diagnosis even when the contamination source remained unknown. The initial auditory symptoms began as a high-pitched ringing sound that patients described using remarkably consistent terminology across different documented cases. The comparison to bronze bells from the abyss appears in medical texts from sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and composed during periods spanning over 1,000 years, suggesting this description was based on shared experiential reality rather than literary convention. The sound intensified gradually over the first week following exposure, developing from occasional brief episodes into constant presence that interfered with normal hearing and made sleep difficult. The visual disturbances manifested as movement in peripheral vision that disappeared when the patient attempted to look directly at the phenomenon. Patients consistently described these as shadows or dark shapes that seemed to move contrary to light sources, creating the impression of entities moving through the environment. The medical texts indicate these visual symptoms typically appeared around the 5th to 7th day after initial exposure, occurring in conjunction with the intensification of auditory phenomena. Unlike the ringing sounds, which were purely auditory hallucinations, the visual disturbances sometimes included external verification, with other observers occasionally reporting anomalous shadows in the presence of contaminated individuals. This external confirmation complicated the medical understanding of these symptoms, suggesting they represented more than simple perceptual dysfunction. The tactile sensations described as the touch of cold fingers from beneath the earth created profound distress in affected individuals. Patients reported feeling phantom touches on their skin, particularly on the back of the neck, shoulders, and extremities. These sensations occurred most frequently during twilight hours and throughout the night, making sleep nearly impossible. The medical texts note that these tactile phenomena left no physical marks or injuries, distinguishing them from conditions involving actual physical assault by demons or spirits, which were believed to cause visible damage. The absence of physical evidence combined with the psychological reality of the sensations created diagnostic challenges for Mesopotamian physicians. The psychological symptoms that emerged as the contamination progressed showed even more disturbing characteristics. The obsessive thoughts about underground spaces began with simple, recurring mental images of caves, tunnels, or chambers beneath the earth. These intrusive thoughts gradually intensified until affected individuals became consumed with the desire to descend into the earth, to seek the depths, or to find the sealed chambers. Medical texts warn that patients in advanced stages of contamination would attempt to dig into floors or foundations, sometimes with their bare hands until their fingers bled, driven by irresistible compulsion to reach the subterranean source of their contamination. The compulsive spiral drawing appeared across numerous documented cases with remarkable consistency. Afflicted individuals would draw or carve descending spiral patterns on any available surface, creating elaborate designs that always spiraled clockwise and inward toward a central point. Mesopotamian physicians interpreted these spirals as visual manifestations of the contaminated individual's psyche being drawn downward into the underworld realm of the imprisoned deity. Archaeological excavations have discovered spiral patterns carved into walls, floors, and objects at various Mesopotamian sites, some located in contexts suggesting they were made by contaminated individuals rather than being intentional decorative or ritual designs. The nightmare content documented in the medical texts shows disturbing similarity across multiple cases spanning different time periods and geographical locations. The dreams invariably involve descent through progressively darker and more chaotic underground spaces, with the dreamer moving deeper despite mounting terror. The deepest chambers encountered in these nightmares contained what the texts describe as the presence that should not be perceived, an entity or force that the dreamer could sense but not directly observe. Patients who experienced these nightmares reported waking with overwhelming dread and certainty that something from the depths was aware of them and attempting to reach them through the dreams. The terminal stages of contamination involved complete psychological collapse, accompanied by physical deterioration that medical texts attributed to the patient's spirit being drawn into the underworld while their body remained alive. Affected individuals became catatonic, unresponsive to external stimuli while appearing to be intensely focused on internal experiences. Observers reported that the eyes of terminal patients appeared to look through the physical world towards something beyond normal perception. Death typically occurred within 40 days of initial exposure to the forbidden name, with patients dying without apparent physical cause, their bodies showing no signs of disease or injury. Medical texts state that the spirits of those who died from forbidden name contamination could not properly enter the normal underworld realm, but became trapped in a state of existence that threatened both the living and the properly dead, requiring special burial protocols to prevent further contamination spreading from the corpse. The city of Eridu, considered the oldest city in Sumerian tradition, and the cult center of the god Enki, preserves texts that provide crucial context for understanding why one particular deity required name suppression, while others in the Anunnaki pantheon could be freely invoked. The Eridu Lament, a composition preserved on multiple tablets from the Old Babylonian period, describes a primordial conflict that occurred before the establishment of the first cities, when the cosmic order was still being determined. The text employs the standard euphemistic substitutions when referring to the unnamed deity, but provides sufficient contextual detail to identify this entity as one of the original Anunnaki, who was banished from the celestial assembly for violations that threatened the fundamental structure of reality. Tablet Vivi AT 8723 from the Atra-Hasis Museum contains the most complete version of this narrative. The text describes how the unnamed deity possessed knowledge of the deep waters beneath the foundations of existence, knowledge that Enki himself found disturbing. The Eridu Lament frames this primordial conflict within a cosmological narrative that describes the organization of the universe following the separation of heaven and earth. According to the text, after Enki claimed the heavens and Enlil claimed the earth's surface, Enki descended to organize the Apsu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that lay beneath the foundations of the world. During this descent, Enki encountered the unnamed deity who already dwelled in the deepest regions of the Apsu, existing there since before the separation of cosmic realms. The text describes this entity as one who knew the waters before they were separated, one who remembered the time of mingling when all things were one. This knowledge of primordial unity represented a fundamental threat to the newly established cosmic order that depended on clear separation and hierarchy. The conflict between Enki and the unnamed deity centered not on territorial claims, but on epistemological authority over the nature of reality itself. The unnamed deity possessed direct experiential knowledge of the undifferentiated state that preceded creation, knowledge that contradicted the fundamental principles upon which the organized cosmos was being constructed. The Eridu Lament describes how the unnamed deity challenged Enlil's authority to impose order, arguing that separation was temporary and artificial, that the natural state of existence was the primordial chaos of undifferentiated potential. This challenge threatened not merely the political authority of the ruling Anunnaki, but the ontological foundations of reality as they were establishing it. The banishment that resulted from this conflict involved more than simple imprisonment. According to the Eridu Lament, Enlil and Enki working together bound the unnamed deity using what the text calls the chains forged from the word of command, linguistic constructs that functioned as metaphysical restraints. The deity was sealed beneath 7 layers of earth, each layer reinforced with different types of barriers including physical walls of stone, magical seals inscribed with binding formulas, and elemental barriers of fire and water. The text specifies that the binding required the combined power of the 3 highest Anunnaki, and provided the authority of heaven. Enlil contributed the force of command, and Enki supplied the knowledge of the deep places necessary to create a prison in the Apsu that could not be escaped. The reason for name suppression emerges clearly from the Eridu Lament's description of the binding process. The text states that the unnamed deity's essence was bound to its true name through metaphysical principles that linked linguistic identity to cosmic manifestation. Speaking the name would create a resonance that weakened the binding seals, potentially allowing the imprisoned deity's influence to reach the surface world. The text employs a simile comparing the name to a rope connecting the depths to the heights, stating that each utterance of the name pulled on this rope, drawing the sealed one closer to the boundary between imprisonment and freedom. This metaphysical linkage between name and presence explains why even written references required suppression, as the act of reading the name aloud would constitute verbal invocation regardless of the reader's intent. The Eridu Lament preserves details about the nature of the forbidden knowledge possessed by the unnamed deity that illuminate why this entity posed such a fundamental threat. The text describes this knowledge as including the true names of all things, the names that existed before the Anunnaki assigned the names of order. In Mesopotamian theological framework, naming constituted an act of creation and control. The assigned names given by the Anunnaki during the organization of the cosmos represented their authority over creation. However, the unnamed deity possessed knowledge of the primordial names, the linguistic patterns that describe things as they existed in their original undifferentiated state. Access to these primordial names would enable one to perceive and potentially restore the chaos that preceded ordered creation. Archaeological evidence from Eridu itself supports the textual accounts of the city's special relationship to the forbidden deity and the knowledge sealed in the depths. Excavations conducted by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 uncovered temple foundations that extended far deeper than architectural necessity would require. The earliest temple levels, dating to approximately 5000 BC, were built over a natural spring that provided fresh water. However, subsequent building phases systematically filled and sealed this spring, creating multiple layers of foundation that buried it beneath approximately 20 meters of construction. The effort required to accomplish this burial far exceeded the labor needed to simply build the temple at ground level, suggesting that sealing the spring served a purpose beyond mere construction. The spring's connection to the Apsu, the subterranean waters that were Enki's domain, and the unnamed deity's prison made it a potential point of contact between the sealed depths and the surface world. The temple foundations included protective inscriptions and buried artifacts that paralleled the magical barriers described in the Eridu Lament. Excavators discovered sheets of copper inscribed with protective formulas buried in the foundation layers, ceramic vessels containing bitumen mixed with aromatic resins sealed within the walls, and carved stone tablets bearing images of Enki and protective deities positioned at cardinal points around the buried spring. These archaeological features demonstrate that the priests of Eridu implemented physical protective measures consistent with the theological understanding preserved in the Lament texts. The positioning of these protections specifically around the spring confirms that they understood it as a dangerous connection point to the imprisoned deity in the depths below. Despite the systematic suppression of the forbidden name in standard cuneiform texts, linguistic analysis reveals that Sumerian scribes embedded the actual name within certain texts, using numerical encoding systems that would be comprehensible only to initiated priests. Sumerian cuneiform employed a sexagesimal numerical system, where each sign possessed both phonetic and numerical values. By calculating the numerical sum of euphemistic phrases and comparing them to divine name values in texts where names were written openly, researchers have identified correspondences that reveal the hidden identity. Dr. Stephen Langdon of Oxford University, working in the 1920s with tablets from the Weld Blundell collection, discovered that the phrase Namba Anda Zuune, when calculated using standard Sumerian Gematria, produces a numerical value of 720. This same numerical value appears in several fragmentary texts where partial divine names are preserved before damage or intentional erasure. The most significant correlation appears in tablet WB62, where the visible portion of a divine name followed by deliberate erasure produces the identical numerical value when the surviving signs are calculated. The sexagesimal numerical system used by Sumerian scribes assigned specific numerical values to each cuneiform sign, based on both its phonetic value and its position in standard sign lists. These numerical values were not arbitrary, but reflected systematic relationships within the scribal tradition. The sign Nam possessed a base value of 60, the sign Ba had a value of 20, the compound Nde carried a value of 360, and the verbal form Zune contributed a value of 280. When these values were summed according to standard geometric calculation methods, the total produced 720. This calculation method appears consistently in mathematical and astronomical texts from the Old Babylonian period, confirming that it represented established scribal practice rather than modern scholarly invention. The significance of the numerical value 720 extends beyond its association with the euphemistic phrase to include astronomical and theological dimensions that illuminate its deeper meaning. 720 represents exactly 12 times 60, making it a complete cycle within the sexagesimal system. Astronomically, 720 corresponded to specific celestial cycles that Mesopotamian astronomers tracked with precision. The number appeared in calculations of Venus cycles, lunar month counts over 60-year periods, and stellar observation sequences. The theological significance of this number appears in its divisibility and multiplicative relationships. 720 equals 8 times 90, 6 times 120, and 40 times 18, each of these factor pairs carrying its own theological significance in Mesopotamian number symbolism. The correlation between the euphemistic phrase's numerical value and partial divine names appears in multiple independent texts, strengthening the evidence that this represents intentional encoding rather than coincidence. Tablet WB62 contains a mythological narrative describing conflicts among the Anunnaki during the Primordial period. At one crucial point in the narrative, the text begins to write a divine name using the standard Dingir determinative followed by the signs Enki. But then the clay surface shows clear evidence of deliberate erasure where additional signs would have completed the name. The surviving signs ENKI carry numerical values of 420 respectively, totaling 420. However, the space of the erasure and the grammatical structure of the sentence indicate that additional signs must have followed. If those missing signs contributed a value of 300 to complete the numerical sequence to 720, they would perfectly complement the pattern established by the euphemistic phrase. Working backward from the required numerical value and the partial preservation, linguistic analysis can reconstruct the probable missing signs. The gap after En-Ki is large enough for exactly 2 cuneiform signs of moderate complexity. To produce a value of 300, the most likely combinations would be either Du-Ra, which would create the compound name Enki-Du-Ra, meaning Lord of Knowledge from the Foundation, or Abzu, which would form Enki-Abzu, translating as Lord of Knowledge from the Apsu. Both reconstructions create theologically coherent divine names that fit the mythological context of the narrative. The compound Enki-Abzu appears particularly significant because it creates a name that describes the unnamed deity's fundamental nature, while simultaneously explaining its relationship to Enki. The name identifies this entity not as a completely separate deity, but as an aspect or manifestation of primordial wisdom associated with the Apsu that became separated from Enki himself during the organization of the cosmos. This interpretation finds support in other mythological texts that describe Enki's descent to the Apsu and his encounter with knowledge that he found troubling, knowledge that had to be sealed away to maintain cosmic order. The encoded name suggests that the forbidden deity represented Enki's own shadow aspect, the dangerous primordial wisdom that had to be suppressed for ordered civilization to exist. Additional numerical correlations appear in astronomical texts that employ geometric encoding to reference the forbidden deity in contexts involving celestial omens and astrology. Tablet BM 34,580 from the British Museum collection contains observations of Venus movements correlated with terrestrial events. One passage describes inauspicious omens associated with Venus appearing in specific stellar configurations. The passage states that when Venus enters the house of the Sealed One and stands in opposition to the Lightbringer, kingdoms will fall and the foundations will tremble. The phrase, House of the Sealed One, employs the Sumerian Bad-Galla, meaning Great Wall or Sealed Place. When calculated geometrically, this phrase produces a value of 720, confirming that it represents another encoded reference to the unnamed deity. The astronomical context reveals that Mesopotamian astrologers associated the forbidden deity with specific celestial regions, particularly zones of the sky associated with darkness, depth, and the underworld. Cross-referencing multiple astronomical texts that employ similar numerical encoding reveals a pattern of associations between the value 720 and celestial phenomena related to eclipses, occultations, and planetary conjunctions that involve Venus and Saturn. These celestial events were interpreted as moments when the barrier between the ordered cosmos and primordial chaos became thin, times when the sealed deity's influence could more easily affect the surface world. The consistency of the numerical encoding across different text types, including mythological narratives, astronomical observations, and ritual instructions, indicates that initiated Mesopotamian priests possessed a sophisticated system for maintaining dangerous knowledge in accessible yet protected form. The geometric encoding allowed essential information about the forbidden deity to be preserved and transmitted through scribal education without requiring direct writing or speaking of the dangerous name. Students who achieved sufficient advancement in scribal training would learn the numerical values and calculation methods necessary to decode these references, gaining access to the forbidden knowledge only after they had received proper theological and ritual preparation. Mesopotamian descent myths, particularly those involving the goddess Inanna's journey to the underworld and Nergal's violent entry into the realm of the dead, contain encoded references to the acquisition of forbidden knowledge from the unnamed deity who was imprisoned beneath the earth. The standard version of Inanna's descent, preserved in multiple copies from both Sumerian and Akkadian sources, describes the goddess's journey through 7 gates to reach the depths of the underworld. While conventional interpretations focus on the mythology of seasonal death and renewal, detailed textual analysis reveals that Inanna's true purpose involved accessing knowledge that had been deliberately buried with the banished deity. Tablet YM 51359 from the Iraq Museum in Baghdad contains a version of the descent narrative that includes additional passages not found in other copies. These passages describe Inanna's acquisition of 7 tablets of forbidden knowledge during her time in the underworld, tablets that contained secrets about the structure of reality itself. The standard version of Inanna's descent describes the goddess announcing her intention to attend the funeral rites of Gugalana, the bull of heaven and husband of Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. This explanation for her journey appears transparently insufficient when examined in context, as Mesopotamian deities rarely showed concern for funeral rites of other divine beings, and Inanna had no established relationship with Gugalana that would explain her attendance at his funeral. The transparent inadequacy of this stated motivation suggests it served as a cover for Inanna's true purpose, which the text deliberately obscured. The 7 gates through which Inanna must pass during her descent correspond structurally to the 7 layers of ceiling described in the Eridu Lament as binding the unnamed deity. At each gate, Inanna must remove one item of her divine regalia, progressively stripping away the markers of her authority and power. Conventional interpretation reads this stripping as symbolic death, the removal of all that characterized Inanna's divine status. However, when examined in light of the forbidden deity narratives, the removal of divine regalia takes on different significance. Each item removed represented a layer of connection to the ordered cosmic hierarchy. By removing these markers, Inanna separated herself from the cosmic order that had been established after the primordial conflict, making herself capable of approaching the sealed deity without triggering the protective barriers that would repel any entity fully bound to the current divine order. The additional passages preserved in tablet WM 51359 describe what occurred during the 3 days and 3 nights that Inanna hung dead on a hook in Ereshkigal's throne room, according to the standard narrative. These passages state that during this period, Inanna's consciousness descended below the floor of the throne room, passing through additional chambers that existed beneath even the underworld's lowest level. The text describes these chambers as existing outside the structure of normal reality, spaces that were neither fully manifest nor completely void, described as the places between existence and non-existence. In the deepest of these chambers, Inanna encountered what the text calls the repository of what was before, a location where knowledge from the primordial chaos had been sealed away. The 7 tablets that Inanna acquired in this deepest chamber contained knowledge that the text describes as dangerous to the stability of the ordered cosmos. The first tablet contained the true names of things, the linguistic patterns that described reality before the Anunnaki imposed the names of order. The second tablet held knowledge of the waters before separation, understanding of the primordial unified state that preceded the division of heaven, earth, and underworld. The third tablet preserved the memory of the time before time, knowledge of existence before the establishment of temporal sequence and causality. The fourth tablet contained understanding of the void beneath the foundations, awareness of the nothing that underlies all existence. The fifth tablet held knowledge of the paths between worlds, the means by which one could move between different levels of reality. The sixth tablet preserved the formulas of unbinding, the linguistic and ritual procedures that could dissolve the barriers between separated things. The seventh tablet, described as the most dangerous, contained the name that unmakes naming, the linguistic pattern that could dissolve the relationship between word and thing, potentially destroying the entire structure of ordered reality that depended on the Anunnaki's naming authority. The text indicates that Inanna did not fully comprehend what these tablets contained during her initial acquisition. She took them because accessing forbidden knowledge represented a way to increase her power and authority among the Anunnaki, not because she understood the fundamental danger they posed. The narrative describes her return to the surface world, carrying the 7 tablets hidden within her being, having been revived by Enki's intervention and allowed to return from death. However, the additional passages describe how Enki, who orchestrated Inanna's revival and return, recognized immediately that she carried forbidden knowledge. The text states that Enki demanded she surrender the tablets, but Inanna refused, claiming them as rightful payment for having survived the descent and return that no other deity had accomplished. The conflict between Inanna and Enki over possession of the forbidden tablets explains several otherwise puzzling elements in Mesopotamian mythology. Inanna's subsequent rise to become one of the most powerful and unpredictable deities in the pantheon reflects her possession of dangerous primordial knowledge that even senior Anunnaki feared. Her association with transgression of boundaries, warfare and chaos alongside her fertility and love aspects makes more sense when understood as resulting from her acquisition of knowledge that existed outside the normal cosmic order. The myths describing Enki's various attempts to retrieve or neutralize dangerous knowledge that Inanna possessed represent ongoing efforts to contain the threat posed by her access to the 7 forbidden tablets. The parallel narrative of Nergal's descent to the underworld contains similar elements, suggesting acquisition of forbidden knowledge, though through violent seizure rather than Inanna's cunning approach. The text describes Nergal forcing his way through the 7 gates of the underworld, defeating the guardians at each threshold through combat rather than submission. Upon reaching Ereshkigal's throne room, Nergal threatens to drag her up to the surface world by her hair unless she grants him co-rulership of the underworld. This violent assertion of dominance results in Nergal becoming the male ruler of the realm of the dead, a position that gave him access to everything contained in the deepest levels beneath the underworld, including the chambers where the unnamed deity remained imprisoned. Textual variants of the Nergal myth describe how his assumption of underworld rulership included responsibility for maintaining the seals that bound the primordial chaos. Some versions indicate that Nergal gained direct knowledge of the sealed deity through this responsibility, learning the forbidden name and the nature of what lay bound beneath the underworld's foundations. This knowledge transformed Nergal from a relatively minor deity associated with plague and war into one of the most feared powers in the Mesopotamian pantheon, his very name becoming associated with destruction and the dissolution of order. The motif of descent to acquire dangerous knowledge appears in variant forms throughout Mesopotamian mythology, suggesting it represented a recognized pattern of divine behavior that the myths both recorded and warned against. The story of Adapa, the sage who accidentally broke the South Wind's wings and was summoned to heaven to face Anu's judgment, includes elements suggesting his true offense involved acquiring forbidden knowledge during a descent to the Apsu. The myths of Gilgamesh's quest for immortality describe him travelling to the depths of the waters to retrieve a plant of eternal life, a journey that parallels the descent narrative structurally and thematically. Each of these myths involves a transgression of boundaries between cosmic realms in pursuit of knowledge or power that existed outside the normal divine order, and each results in consequences that extend far beyond the individual who made the descent. The architectural layouts of major Mesopotamian temples reveal sophisticated design features specifically intended to prevent influence or communication from the imprisoned deity in the underworld reaching the surface world. Analysis of temple foundations at Ur, Uruk, and Babylon demonstrates consistent implementation of protective architectural principles that go far beyond normal construction practices. The ziggurat at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, incorporates foundation layers that include unusual materials arranged in specific sequences. Below the standard fired brick and bitumen construction, the foundation includes layers of crushed magnetite, sheets of copper inscribed with protective incantations, and buried ceramic vessels containing substances identified through chemical analysis as containing high concentrations of sulfur compounds. These materials created electromagnetic and chemical barriers intended to prevent subterranean energies from rising through the temple structure. The positioning of these protective layers directly below chambers where priests performed rituals involving ecstatic trance states suggests specific concern about communication attempts from below during altered states of consciousness. The foundation excavations at Ur revealed a complex layering system that extended approximately 12 meters below the ziggurat's ground-level platform. The deepest layer consisted of compacted clay mixed with crushed magnetite, creating a dark grey stratum approximately 1 meter thick. Above this magnetic barrier, builders installed a layer of river sand approximately half a meter thick that created both physical separation and drainage capacity. The third layer consisted of specially prepared ceramic tiles, each inscribed with a single cuneiform sign representing protective deities or warding formulas. These tiles were laid face down so that the inscriptions faced toward the earth, symbolically directing their protective power downward against threats rising from below. Above the ceramic tile layer, workers installed sheets of copper, approximately 2 millimeters thick, that had been inscribed with longer protective formulas before being placed in the foundation. Chemical analysis of these copper sheets revealed that they had been treated with solutions containing salt, vinegar, and other substances that created a mild electrical potential in the presence of groundwater, generating a weak electromagnetic field throughout the foundation layer. The copper sheets were not continuous but were arranged in a grid pattern with gaps filled by bitumen mixed with aromatic resins, including frankincense and myrrh. This alternating pattern of conductive copper and insulating bitumen created a complex electromagnetic structure whose purpose exceeded simple waterproofing or structural reinforcement. Above these specialized protective layers, the foundation continued with more conventional construction, including standard fired brick, reed mats, and bitumen layers that provided structural support and waterproofing. However, even these upper foundation levels incorporated elements that suggested protective rather than purely structural function. The fired bricks used in the foundation levels directly beneath the ziggurat's central shrine contained clay from 7 different sources, each clay type associated with a specific protective deity or cosmic region. Ceramic analysis conducted by the British Museum in the 1970s identified the distinct chemical signatures of clays from sites associated with Enlil at Nippur, Enki at Eridu, Inanna at Uruk, Shamash at Sippar, Sin at Ur itself, and 2 additional sources that remain unidentified. The symbolic significance of combining clays from these 7 sacred sources created a foundation that drew protective power from multiple divine authorities simultaneously. The buried ceramic vessels discovered within the foundation layers contained residues that chemical analysis identified as sulfur compounds, mixed with bitumen and various plant resins. The sulfur concentration significantly exceeded levels that would occur naturally, indicating deliberate preparation of these compounds for specific purposes. In Mesopotamian religious thought, sulfur was associated with purification and the creation of barriers against demonic or chaotic influences. The distinctive smell of burning sulfur was believed to repel malevolent entities and disrupt their ability to manifest in the physical world. The placement of sulfur compounds in sealed vessels throughout the foundation created a chemical barrier that would release protective vapors if the containers were ever broken, functioning as a kind of passive defense system against intrusion from below. The positioning of the most elaborate protective features directly beneath the ziggurat's summit shrine, where the high priest performed the sacred marriage ritual and other trance-inducing ceremonies, reveals sophisticated understanding of metaphysical vulnerability. Mesopotamian religious practice involved ritual techniques designed to alter consciousness and enable communication with divine realms. These altered states created temporary weakening of the boundaries between different levels of reality, making practitioners vulnerable to contact with entities that existed outside the normal cosmic order. The priests recognized that the same trance states that enabled communication with the ordained Anunnaki could also create openings for contact with the sealed deity imprisoned beneath the earth. The protective architectural features concentrated beneath the trance ritual chambers functioned as metaphysical insulation, preventing such unwanted contact. Similar protective foundation architecture appears at other major temple sites throughout Mesopotamia, with variations that reflect local theological emphasis while maintaining core protective principles. The Eanna temple complex at Uruk, excavated by German archaeological teams between 1899 and 1939, incorporated foundation layers that included a 1-meter thick stratum of crushed limestone mixed with lapis lazuli fragments. The lapis lazuli, an intensely blue stone highly valued in Mesopotamian culture and associated with the heavens and divine authority, created a symbolic barrier representing celestial power, blocking communication from the underworld depths. Chemical analysis revealed that the limestone had been heated before crushing, a process that would have created quicklime with caustic properties that enhanced the protective qualities of the foundation layer. The Asagila temple complex at Babylon, dedicated to Marduk, employed the most elaborate protective foundation architecture yet discovered. Excavations by Robert Coldaway revealed foundation layers extending over 15 meters below the temple platform. The deepest layers included a 3-meter thick deposit of crushed shells from the Persian Gulf, mixed with clay, creating a white stratum that symbolically represented the primordial waters of the Apsu, while simultaneously blocking direct connection to them. Above this shell layer, builders installed alternating layers of brick and bitumen, each brick layer inscribed with protective formulas, and each bitumen layer mixed with different aromatic and mineral additives. The sequence of additives included cedar oil, cypress resin, myrrh, sulfur, and pulverized precious stones including carnelian, lapis lazuli, and obsidian. Each additive carried specific protective associations in Mesopotamian religious thought, creating a complex multi-layered barrier that addressed threats from different sources and operating through different metaphysical principles. The architectural evidence demonstrates that Mesopotamian temple builders understood foundation construction as fundamentally protective in nature rather than merely structural. The massive investment of resources and labor required to create these elaborate foundation systems far exceeded what structural engineering alone would demand. The temple at Ur could have been built on much simpler foundations and remained structurally sound. The decision to invest enormous additional resources in protective features reveals that the temple authorities considered the metaphysical threats from below to be genuine dangers requiring serious practical response. Mesopotamian ritual compendia contain detailed procedures that priests must follow when entering subterranean chambers where texts about the forbidden deity were stored, or when performing ceremonies that involved invoking knowledge from the depths. These procedures, preserved in the ritual series known as the Shurpu, reveal sophisticated understanding of psychological and metaphysical dangers associated with accessing forbidden knowledge. Tablet K 6324 from Ashurbanipal's library provides the most comprehensive protective procedures. The text specifies that priests must undergo ritual purification lasting 40 days, during which they consume only bread and water while abstaining from sexual activity and avoiding exposure to sunlight during specific hours. The purification includes daily recitation of protective formulas invoking Enki, Marduk, and the 7 Apkallu sages who opposed the unnamed deity during the primordial conflict. Before entering the sealed chambers, priests must inscribe protective symbols on their bodies using a mixture of cedar oil and pulverized lapis lazuli. The 40-day purification period described in Tablet K 6324 corresponds to significant temporal cycles in Mesopotamian religious practice and astronomical observation. 40 days represented approximately one complete cycle of Venus's appearance as either morning or evening star before transitioning to invisibility, a celestial pattern that Mesopotamian astronomers tracked with precision. The correlation between the purification period and Venus cycles suggests that the ritual procedures were synchronized with astronomical phenomena that influenced the metaphysical conditions affecting the safety of accessing forbidden knowledge. The text specifies that purification must begin when Venus first appears as the morning star following a period of invisibility, ensuring that the 40-day period would conclude with Venus still visible, providing celestial protection during the actual chamber access. The dietary restrictions limiting consumption to bread and water reflect Mesopotamian understanding of how physical substances affected spiritual purity and metaphysical vulnerability. Bread represented the fundamental civilized food, grain transformed through human labor and fire into sustenance that symbolized the ordered cosmos. Water, particularly fresh water from springs or rivers, connected symbolically to the Apsu and Enki's domain, providing purification and protection specifically against dangers emerging from the depths. The exclusion of meat, wine, and all other foods removed from the priest's body substances associated with blood, intoxication, and sensual pleasure, all of which were understood to create spiritual vulnerability. The text indicates that breaking these dietary restrictions would contaminate the purification process and require starting the 40-day period again from the beginning. The prohibition against sexual activity during purification served multiple functions in Mesopotamian ritual thought. Sexual activity created temporary connection between individuals that could transmit spiritual contamination, making the sexually active person vulnerable to whatever their partner had been exposed to. Additionally, sexual activity involved temporary dissolution of individual boundaries, a state that paralleled in small scale the primordial chaos of undifferentiated existence that the forbidden deity represented. Maintaining sexual abstinence preserved the priest's individual integrity and separated them from experiences of boundary dissolution that could create resonance with the sealed deity's chaotic nature. The text specifies that sexual abstinence must continue for 7 days following the chamber access, suggesting that vulnerability persisted even after leaving the sealed spaces. The restrictions on sunlight exposure required priests to remain indoors during the 6 hours surrounding midday, when the sun reached its highest position. This timing restriction served to limit the priest's exposure to Shamash, the sun god who represented cosmic order, judgment, and divine law. The logic behind this seemingly counterintuitive restriction becomes clear when examined in context. Shamash embodied the cosmic order that the Anunnaki had established following the primordial conflict. A priest preparing to access knowledge that existed outside and potentially threatened this order needed to temporarily separate themselves from connection to the divine powers that most strongly represented ordered cosmos. By avoiding full sunlight, the priest reduced their connection to Shamash's ordering influence, making themselves capable of perceiving and handling knowledge that existed in the spaces outside divine order without suffering immediate destruction from the contradiction. The daily recitation of protective formulas invoking Enki, Marduk, and the 7 Apkallu sages created a ritual framework that maintained the priest's connection to authorized divine protection while they prepared to access unauthorized knowledge. The text provides the complete formulas in both Sumerian and Akkadian, specifying exact wording that must not be altered. The invocation of Enki requested protection based on his mastery of the Apsu and his authority over the deep waters where the forbidden deity was imprisoned. The invocation of Marduk requested protection based on his victory over Tiamat and his authority to establish and maintain cosmic order against chaos. The invocation of the 7 Apkallu sages requested protection based on their wisdom and their opposition to the unnamed deity during the primordial conflict. By invoking these specific divine powers, the priests created a metaphysical shield composed of the very authorities that had defeated and imprisoned the forbidden deity, making themselves representatives of the binding powers rather than independent individuals who could be targeted by the sealed entity. The protective symbols that priests must inscribe on their bodies before chamber entry included specific cuneiform signs and geometric patterns that possessed both linguistic and magical significance. The text specifies 7 primary symbols that must be inscribed on specific body locations. The forehead received the sign for Shamash, representing light and order, protecting the priest's perception and consciousness. The throat received the sign for Enki, protecting the priest's speech and preventing involuntary utterance of the forbidden name. The heart received the sign for Enlil, protecting the priest's will and authority. The palms of both hands received protective signs for Marduk, ensuring that anything the priest touched would be sanctified by Marduk's ordering power. The soles of both feet received signs representing the Apkallu sages, protecting the priest's movement through dangerous spaces. The mixture used for inscribing these symbols combined cedar oil and pulverized lapis lazuli in specific proportions. Cedar oil possessed purifying and protective properties in Mesopotamian thought, its strong fragrance believed to repel malevolent influences. Lapis lazuli, with its deep blue color resembling the heavens, represented celestial authority and divine power. The combination created a substance that inscribed divine protective power directly onto the priest's physical body, transforming them temporarily into a living embodiment of protective magic. The inscriptions remained visible on the skin throughout the chamber access and for several days afterward, serving as continuing protection during the vulnerable period following exposure to forbidden knowledge. The Atra-Hasis epic, one of the most important Mesopotamian flood narratives, contains within its cosmological framework references to conflicts among the Anunnaki that resulted in the imprisonment of certain divine beings beneath the earth. While most scholarly attention focuses on the epic's flood narrative and creation of humanity, earlier sections describe organizational struggles within the divine assembly that provide context for the banishment and naming prohibition. The Old Babylonian version preserved on tablets from the early 2nd millennium BC describes how certain Anunnaki were assigned to work in the Apsu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth. These assignments created resentment that led to rebellion against the authority of Enlil and the established cosmic order. The text describes how one unnamed deity refused to accept the hierarchical structure and sought to access knowledge about the fundamental structure of reality that was reserved for Anu and Enlil alone. The rebellion was suppressed through combined action of Enki and Enlil, who imprisoned the rebellious deity in the deepest levels of the Apsu. The opening sections of the Atra-Hasis epic describe the initial organization of the cosmos, following the separation of heaven and earth, when the senior Anunnaki established the hierarchical structure that would govern divine society and cosmic order. The text states that Anu ascended to heaven, Enlil claimed the earth, and Enki descended to rule the Apsu. However, the work required to maintain cosmic order and organize the various domains necessitated labor from lesser divine beings known as the Igigi. These junior deities were assigned specific tasks including digging irrigation channels in the Apsu, maintaining the boundaries between cosmic realms, and performing the physical labor necessary to sustain the divine household. The text describes 40 years of such labor, during which resentment grew among the Igigi who felt their work was beneath their divine status. The rebellion that eventually erupted involved more than simple labor disputes. Tablet 1 of the Atra-Hasis epic describes how the Igigi gathered in secret council and determined to confront Enlil with demands for relief from their burdens. However, the text indicates that one particular deity among the Igigi argued for a more fundamental challenge to the entire cosmic hierarchy. This unnamed deity, described only through euphemistic phrases such as the one who questioned the ordering and he who remembered what was before, claimed that the hierarchical structure imposed by Anu and Enlil was artificial and temporary, that it contradicted the true nature of reality which was fundamentally undifferentiated and chaotic. The text describes this deity's argument that separation itself was violence against the natural state of existence, and that the proper response was not to negotiate for better working conditions, but to dissolve the boundaries that Anu and Enlil had imposed on reality. This philosophical challenge threatened not merely the labour arrangements of divine society, but the ontological foundations of ordered existence itself. The confrontation between the rebellious Agigi and Enlil forms one of the epic's crucial episodes. The text describes how the Agigi surrounded Enlil's temple at night, setting fire to their tools as symbols of their refusal to continue working. Enlil, awakened by the commotion, initially responded with anger and threats of punishment. However, the intervention of Enki, who ascended from the Apsu to mediate the dispute, prevented immediate violent conflict. Enki proposed the creation of humans to assume the labour burdens that had fallen on the Agigi, a solution that would relieve the lesser deities without requiring fundamental reorganisation of cosmic hierarchy. The text indicates that most of the Agigi accepted this compromise, but the unnamed deity who had advocated for dissolving cosmic boundaries rejected the proposal and continued to resist. The suppression of this continuing resistance required combined action by Enki and Enlil working together, an unusual alliance given their frequent conflicts in other mythological narratives. The text describes how Enki, using his wisdom and knowledge of the deep places, created bindings composed of the essence of separation itself, metaphysical chains that reinforced the boundaries between things rather than being physical restraints. Enlil contributed his authority and the force of divine command, speaking words of binding that could not be refused or resisted. Together they imprisoned the rebellious deity in the deepest chamber of the Apsu, sealing it beneath 7 layers that corresponded to the 7 aspects of cosmic order that the deity had challenged. These 7 sealing layers each addressed different dimensions of the imprisoned deity's power and knowledge. The first layer was physical, consisting of stone walls that prevented bodily movement or escape. The second layer was elemental, composed of fire and water barriers that prevented manipulation of material substances. The third layer was temporal, creating a time lock that prevented the imprisoned deity from perceiving or influencing events occurring at different time periods. The fourth layer was spatial, establishing distance that could not be traversed regardless of power or will. The fifth layer was linguistic, preventing the imprisoned deity from speaking or being spoken to, except under specific conditions. The sixth layer was cognitive, blocking the deity's ability to project thoughts or influence the minds of other beings. The seventh and final layer was metaphysical, severing the deity's connection to the current cosmic order while maintaining just enough linkage to prevent complete dissolution into non-existence. The text indicates that this final layer created the fundamental problem that would later necessitate the naming prohibition. The imprisoned deity could not be completely disconnected from reality, because doing so would cause it to cease existing entirely, which would release its knowledge and power back into the undifferentiated chaos from which all things emerged. Maintaining minimal connection preserved the deity's individual existence while keeping it sealed, but that connection created a metaphysical thread that could be activated through speaking the deity's true name. Each utterance of the name strengthened this thread, potentially allowing the imprisoned deity's influence to reach through the 7 sealing layers into the ordered cosmos. The Atra-Hasis epic describes the aftermath of the imprisonment as a period of cosmic reorganization, during which the Anunnaki established protocols to prevent similar challenges in the future. These protocols included the creation of humans to perform labor, the establishment of clearer hierarchical structures among divine beings, and the implementation of the naming prohibition to prevent accidental invocation of the sealed deity. The text states that the 7 Apkallu sages were charged with maintaining knowledge about the imprisonment, while ensuring that such knowledge could not be accidentally or deliberately misused. These wise beings established the educational systems, ritual procedures, and architectural protections that would characterize Mesopotamian civilization's approach to containing and managing dangerous primordial knowledge. The correlation between the Atra-Hasis epic's imprisonment narrative and the flood story that follows in later sections of the text reveals additional dimensions of the theological framework. The flood, according to the epic, was Enlil's response to the noise of humanity disturbing his rest. However, when examined in light of the earlier imprisonment narrative, the flood takes on additional significance as a periodic cleansing, designed to prevent accumulated human knowledge from approaching the dangerous boundaries where it might accidentally invoke or release the sealed deity. Enki's warning to Atra-Hasis and his instructions for building the survival vessel represent not merely divine mercy, but a calculated decision to preserve human civilization while resetting its knowledge accumulation, preventing humans from developing understanding that could threaten the sealing layers. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with the Atra-Hasis narrative supports the historical reality behind these mythological accounts. Excavations at Shuruppak, the city where Atra-Hasis served as king according to the epic, uncovered flood deposits dating to approximately 2900 BC that match the epic's chronology. More significantly, excavations beneath these flood layers revealed temple foundations that incorporated the same protective architectural features found at other sites, including buried protective inscriptions, chemical barriers in foundation layers, and sealed chambers containing tablets marked with warnings. The consistency between the mythological narrative and the physical evidence suggests that the Atra-Hasis epic preserved genuine historical memory of events surrounding the imprisonment of a dangerous primordial deity and the establishment of protocols designed to prevent its influence from affecting the surface world. Egyptian religious texts preserve parallel narratives about primordial deities associated with chaos who were defeated and imprisoned rather than destroyed, suggesting shared theological concepts across ancient Near Eastern civilizations regarding the treatment of dangerous divine knowledge. The entity known as Apep or Apophis in Egyptian mythology shows remarkable parallels to the unnamed Mesopotamian deity in terms of cosmic function, imprisonment narratives, and ongoing threat despite containment. Pyramid texts and coffin texts dating from the Old and Middle Kingdoms describe Apep as existing in the primordial darkness before creation, possessing knowledge of the void that preceded existence. Like the Mesopotamian unnamed deity, Apep could not be fully destroyed but required constant containment through ritual procedures. The Egyptian concept of Apep being cut into pieces yet remaining dangerous parallels Mesopotamian references to the unnamed deity being bound and sealed, yet still capable of influencing those who approach its knowledge. The pyramid texts, inscribed in the burial chambers of Old Kingdom pharaohs dating from approximately 2400 BC, contain the earliest references to Apep as a primordial force that must be continuously defeated to maintain cosmic order. Spell 393 from the pyramid texts of Pepi. The first describes Apep as the serpent who existed before Ra created the world, dwelling in the waters of Nun, the primordial ocean of non-existence that surrounded and underlay creation. The text describes Apep as possessing knowledge of the state before separation, when all things existed in undifferentiated potential within Nun's chaotic waters. This description parallels precisely the Mesopotamian accounts of the unnamed deity possessing knowledge from before the separation of heaven and earth. The theological framework surrounding both entities treats their primordial knowledge as fundamentally threatening to the stability of ordered existence. The daily cycle of Ra's journey through the sky and the underworld incorporated continuous ritual combat with Apep as a necessary component of maintaining cosmic order. The pyramid texts and later sources describe how Apep attempts to stop Ra's solar bark during its nightly journey through the underworld, seeking to prevent the sun's return and plunge the world back into primordial darkness. However, protective deities including Set, the paradoxical god of chaos who nonetheless defended cosmic order against greater chaos, fought Apep each night to ensure Ra's continued journey. The perpetual nature of this conflict reveals that Egyptian theology understood Apep as incapable of permanent defeat. Unlike other enemies of the gods who could be killed and eliminated, Apep required continuous combat and constant vigilance because its existence was fundamental to the cosmological structure. The coffin texts from the Middle Kingdom period around 2000 BC elaborate on the theology of Apep's nature and the reasons for its permanent threat. Spell 1030 describes Apep as having been cut into pieces by Re following the initial creation, with each piece buried in different locations beneath the earth. However, the text indicates that these separated pieces retained connection to each other and to Apep's consciousness, making the entity simultaneously divided and unified. This paradoxical state parallels Mesopotamian descriptions of the unnamed deity being bound beneath 7 seals, yet remaining capable of influence through metaphysical connections that could not be completely severed. The cutting of Apep into pieces served to limit its power and prevent unified action, but could not eliminate the fundamental threat it posed. The ritual procedures developed by Egyptian priests to contain Apep's influence demonstrate sophisticated understanding of the relationship between spoken words, written texts, and metaphysical power that parallels Mesopotamian naming prohibitions. The Book of Overthrowing Apep, a ritual compendium preserved in multiple copies from temples at Karnak and other sites, provides detailed instructions for daily ceremonies designed to maintain Apep's containment. These rituals included creating wax figures of Apep, which priests would ceremonially cut into pieces, burn, and dissolve in water, while reciting specific incantations. The text emphasizes that certain names of Apep must never be spoken aloud during these rituals, despite the need to reference the entity. Instead, priests employed euphemistic phrases such as the Evil One or the Serpent of Rebellion that avoided direct naming while maintaining ritual efficacy. The theological reasoning behind the naming prohibition in Egyptian texts mirrors Mesopotamian understanding. The Book of Overthrowing Apep states that speaking Apep's true names would strengthen the entity's presence in the world, making it harder to defeat in the nightly combat. The text describes names as creating metaphysical anchors that bound abstract or distant entities to manifest reality. Using Apep's true names would anchor its chaotic essence more firmly to the ordered world, potentially allowing it to exert greater influence. The ritual texts specify that only in the deepest chambers of temples, under specific astronomical conditions, could initiated priests speak certain names of Apep for the purpose of understanding its nature and developing more effective containment procedures. Cross-cultural transmission of these theological concepts between Egypt and Mesopotamia appears in multiple forms of evidence. Trade contacts between the two civilizations existed from the earliest periods, with Mesopotamian artifacts appearing in Egyptian contexts from the pre-dynastic period and Egyptian objects found at Mesopotamian sites. More significantly, the theological concepts show structural parallels too specific to represent independent development. Both traditions describe primordial chaos entities that cannot be destroyed. Both employ naming prohibitions to prevent strengthening these entities. Both describe them as possessing dangerous knowledge from before creation, and both developed elaborate ritual and architectural systems to maintain containment. The timing of when these parallel concepts appear in each civilization's textual record suggests knowledge flow in both directions. Some theological concepts appear first in Mesopotamian sources and later in Egyptian texts, while others show the reverse pattern. This bidirectional transmission indicates active intellectual exchange between the scribal and priestly classes of both civilizations. The intermediary role of Syria-Palestine, particularly cities like Ebla and Ugarit that maintained contact with both Egypt and Mesopotamia, provided mechanisms for such exchange. Tablets from Ebla, dating to approximately 2400 BC, contain texts that reference both Mesopotamian and Egyptian divine names, suggesting that the scribes of this region served as cultural translators who facilitated the spread of theological concepts. The concept of dangerous primordial knowledge requiring permanent containment rather than destruction appears to represent a shared theological insight developed through interaction between these ancient civilizations. Both cultures recognized that certain aspects of reality could not be eliminated without destroying the cosmos itself, that primordial chaos was not simply the absence of order, but a positive force that had to be continuously contained and managed. This sophisticated understanding distinguished both Egyptian and Mesopotamian theology from simpler good versus evil frameworks by recognizing that the powers opposing cosmic order possessed legitimate existence and could not be permanently eliminated, only perpetually constrained through ritual action and vigilant maintenance of metaphysical boundaries. The Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, while focused primarily on Marduk's rise to supremacy and his victory over the primordial goddess Tiamat, contains embedded references to knowledge that must be suppressed following the establishment of the current cosmic order. The epic describes how Marduk defeated Tiamat and created the world from her body, but closer analysis of the text reveals that certain aspects of Tiamat's nature and knowledge were deliberately sealed away rather than incorporated into the new creation. Tablet 4 of the Enuma Elish, preserved in copies from Ashurbanipal's library, describes how Marduk imprisons certain aspects of primordial chaos in the foundations of the earth after his victory. The text states that he established guards over the deep so that its waters could not escape, but the language employed suggests this containment applied to more than physical waters. References to sealing the secrets of the deep and binding the knowledge of the abyss indicate that dangerous primordial wisdom was deliberately buried. The narrative structure of the Enuma Elish describes a cosmological progression from undifferentiated chaos to organized cosmos through violent conflict and imposition of order. The epic opens with a description of the primordial state when sweetwater Apsu and saltwater Tiamat mingled together in undifferentiated unity. From this mingling, the younger gods emerged, their activity and noise disturbing the primordial quiet. Apsu's desire to destroy the younger gods to restore silence led to his defeat by Enki, who used magical sleep to neutralize Apsu, and then killed him, establishing himself in Apsu's waters. Tiamat's subsequent rage at Apsu's death and her creation of monsters to war against the younger gods set the stage for Marduk's emergence as champion of the divine assembly. Marduk's victory over Tiamat involved not only military defeat but cosmological reorganization that transformed Tiamat's body into the structure of the ordered world. Tablet 4 describes how Marduk split Tiamat's corpse, using half to create the sky and half to create the earth. He positioned her eyes to become the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, arranged her tail to form the Milky Way, and organized her internal organs into various cosmic features. However, the text contains references to aspects of Tiamat that were not incorporated into creation, but were instead sealed away. The phrase most frequently overlooked in conventional analysis appears in the passage describing Marduk's establishment of cosmic order following Tiamat's defeat. The text states that he bound the waters of the deep with chains of heaven and established guards to watch that the waters never escaped their bounds. The plural form waters of the deep rather than simply water suggests multiple aspects or types of primordial liquid being constrained. Linguistic analysis of the Akkadian terminology reveals that the phrase includes concepts of knowledge, wisdom, and secrets alongside the physical water imagery. The deep waters that must not escape include dangerous primordial knowledge about the state before separation and organization. The guards established by Marduk to watch over the sealed deep appear in the text as unnamed divine functionaries whose sole purpose is maintaining the containment. Later, Babylonian texts identify these guards with specific minor deities associated with boundaries, thresholds, and barriers, suggesting that Mesopotamian theology developed an entire class of divine beings whose function centered on preventing escape of what Marduk had sealed. The architectural and ritual parallels between these textual descriptions and the physical protective features found in temple foundations suggest that the guards of the deep represented not merely mythological figures but practical ritual functions that Mesopotamian priests performed to maintain the sealing of dangerous knowledge. The relationship between Tiamat and the unnamed deity, whose name required suppression, becomes clearer when examining the theological framework of the Enuma Elish in its broader context. The epic presents Tiamat as the embodiment of primordial chaos who must be defeated to enable ordered creation. However, her defeat and transformation into cosmic structure does not eliminate chaos entirely, but rather organizes it into manageable form. The sealed aspects of Tiamat represent the elements of primordial chaos that could not be safely incorporated into ordered reality, and therefore had to be imprisoned rather than transformed. The unnamed deity functions within this theological system as the conscious aspect of this sealed chaos, the intentional force that remembers and seeks to restore the undifferentiated primordial state. The Enuma Elish describes Marduk's acquisition of supreme authority through his victory over Tiamat, including the power to determine destiny and assign names. Tablet 5 describes how the assembled gods granted Marduk 50 names, each representing a specific aspect of his power and authority. The act of naming functions within the epic as the fundamental mechanism through which Marduk exercises control over reality. By naming things, Marduk determines their nature and function within the ordered cosmos. This theological framework explains why an unnamed deity poses such fundamental threat. An entity without an assigned name from Marduk exists outside his ordering authority, retaining connection to the primordial state before Marduk imposed organization on chaos. The suppression of this entity's original name prevents it from being incorporated into Marduk's ordered system, while the prohibition against speaking the name prevents it from manifesting within that system. The theological sophistication of this framework demonstrates that Mesopotamian religious thought understood naming as far more than arbitrary labeling, recognizing it as the fundamental mechanism through which divine authority structured reality. The epilogue of the Enuma Elish contains references to the ongoing necessity of maintaining cosmic order against the ever-present threat of chaos returning. The text describes annual ritual reenactments of Marduk's victory during the Akitu New Year festival, ceremonies designed not merely to commemorate past events, but to actively renew the cosmic order for another year. The ritual texts associated with these reenactments include specific procedures for reinforcing the seals that bind the waters of the deep, confirming that Mesopotamian priests understood Marduk's victory as requiring continuous ritual maintenance rather than representing permanent resolution. The containment of sealed knowledge required active effort to prevent its escape or influence on the ordered world. Comparative analysis reveals that the Enuma Elish represents a Babylonian theological response to older Sumerian traditions about primordial conflict and sealed knowledge. The epic was composed during the Old Babylonian period when Babylon was rising to political and cultural dominance over southern Mesopotamia. The text's elevation of Marduk to supreme authority over the pantheon reflects Babylon's political ambitions, while incorporating older theological concepts about dangerous primordial knowledge that required permanent containment. The Sumerian traditions about the unnamed deity sealed in the Apsu were reframed within the Enuma Elish as aspects of Tiamat that Marduk bound following his victory, adapting older theology to support newer political and religious structures while maintaining the core insight about knowledge that was too dangerous to remain accessible. Akkadian magical texts from the 1st millennium BC contain extensive incantation series designed to prevent influence from subterranean sources, specifically addressing threats emanating from imprisoned primordial entities. The incantation series known as Utukku Lemnutu, meaning evil demons, includes sections specifically targeting what the texts call the whispers from the sealed one. These incantations were recited by priests who experienced symptoms consistent with exposure to the forbidden name, or who had disturbing dreams involving descent into subterranean chambers. Tablet K 2347 from the British Museum collection preserves one of the most detailed anti-contamination incantations. The text describes the threat as arising when the seals weakened, suggesting that the imprisonment of the forbidden deity required ongoing ritual maintenance to prevent escape or influence. The incantation invokes Marduk's authority from his victory over Tiamat, Enki's mastery over the Apsu, and Shamash's solar power to drive back the rising darkness. The Utukku Lemnutu series comprises approximately 100 tablets organized into multiple subseries, addressing different categories of malevolent supernatural entities and the incantations effective against them. The organization of the series reflects sophisticated Mesopotamian understanding of different types of supernatural threats, requiring different defensive approaches. Demons of sickness required incantations invoking healing deities and employing purification imagery. Ghosts of the improperly buried dead required incantations that addressed their specific grievances and provided ritual substitutes for proper burial. The sub-series addressing contamination from the sealed one occupied a distinct category, because this threat originated not from external malevolent entities, but from contact with knowledge that existed outside the normal cosmic order. The incantations in this sub-series combined defensive and restorative elements designed both to prevent further contamination and to purify individuals already affected. The symptoms that triggered use of these incantations match precisely those described in medical texts dealing with forbidden name exposure. Tablet K 2347 specifies that the anti-contamination incantation should be employed when an individual experiences whispers in unknown languages, sees shadows that move against light, feels phantom touches particularly during twilight and night hours, demonstrates obsessive interest in underground spaces, or compulsively draws spiral patterns. The text emphasizes that early intervention produces better outcomes, recommending that incantations begin at the first sign of auditory phenomena rather than waiting for psychological symptoms to develop. The delay of even a few days could allow contamination to progress beyond the point where ritual intervention remained effective. The structure of the primary anti-contamination incantation, preserved in K 2347, follows a sophisticated theological logic that addresses multiple aspects of the contamination simultaneously. The incantation opens with an invocation of Shamash, requesting the sun god's presence and power. The text specifies that this invocation must be performed at sunrise when Shamash's power is ascending, symbolically representing the triumph of order and light over chaos and darkness. The incantation addresses Shamash as the Lord of Judgment, who sees all things and whose light penetrates even the deepest darkness, requesting that his illumination reach into the contaminated individual's consciousness to drive out the whispers from below. The second section invokes Marduk's authority, specifically referencing his victory over Tiamat and his establishment of cosmic order. This invocation employs the theological framework of the Enuma Elish, reminding Marduk that he defeated primordial chaos and organized reality according to proper hierarchy. The incantation requests that Marduk extend his ordering power to reorganize the contaminated individual's consciousness, separating the whispers from the sealed one from the person's own thoughts and perceptions. The language emphasizes Marduk's authority to name and thereby control all aspects of reality, implicitly requesting that he reassert proper naming authority over the unnamed influences affecting the contaminated person. The third section invokes Enki in his capacity as master of the Apsu and the one who understands the deep places. This invocation recognizes that contamination originating from the sealed deity imprisoned in the Apsu requires intervention from the deity who rules those depths. The incantation addresses Enki as the wise one who knows all secrets, yet maintains proper boundaries, who descended to the deep waters yet retained his connection to the ordered cosmos. The text requests that Enki use his knowledge of the Apsu to strengthen the seals binding the imprisoned deity, preventing further influence from rising to contaminate the surface world. The invocation specifically asks Enki to cut the threads of connection between the sealed one and the contaminated individual, severing the metaphysical linkages that allowed the contamination to occur. The fourth section of the incantation employs protective imagery drawn from multiple theological sources. The text invokes the 7 Apkallu sages who opposed the unnamed deity during the primordial conflict, requesting their wisdom to recognize and counter the specific nature of the contamination. The invocation names each of the 7 sages individually, reciting their legendary accomplishments in establishing the foundations of civilization and preserving knowledge in proper hierarchical order. By invoking these specific figures, the incantation creates a protective framework composed of the very powers that had successfully contained the sealed deity in the distant past. The fifth and final section of the incantation addresses the contaminated individual directly, speaking to their consciousness as separate from the contaminating influence. This section employs first-person language, creating a ritual script that the affected person can recite as an act of will, asserting their individual identity against the dissolving influence of primordial chaos. The text declares that the speaker is a servant of the ordained gods, a being of the ordered cosmos who rejects all connection to the chaos that preceded creation. The declaration explicitly renounces any knowledge gained from the sealed one, treating such knowledge as theft that must be returned to its proper imprisoned state. The incantation concludes with a binding formula that seals the renunciation and requests divine protection against future contamination. The ritual procedures accompanying the incantation specified in K 2347 demonstrate practical understanding of psychological and spiritual purification processes. The text requires that the contaminated individual undergo 7 days of intensive purification while reciting the incantation at sunrise and sunset each day. During this period, they must remain within the temple complex boundaries, consume only bread and water, avoid all contact with darkness by maintaining constant lamplight, and inscribe protective symbols on their body using the same cedar oil and lapis lazuli mixture employed by priests entering sealed chambers. The 7-day duration corresponds to the progression of contamination symptoms described in medical texts, with the ritual intervention designed to interrupt and reverse the contamination process before it reached irreversible stages. The requirement for ongoing ritual maintenance to prevent the seals from weakening appears throughout the Utuku Lemnutu series and related texts. Tablet K 4932 describes annual ceremonies that must be performed to renew the binding seals, prevent the imprisoned deity's influence from gradually permeating upward through the earth, and maintain the strength of the protective barriers built into temple foundations. These annual rituals involved processions to specific locations identified as particularly vulnerable points, where the boundary between the sealed depths and the surface world was thin, performance of elaborate sealing ceremonies that combined physical actions with spoken incantations, and offerings designed to strengthen the protective deities who guarded the imprisoned entity. The text indicates that failure to perform these maintenance rituals would allow gradual degradation of the seals, making contamination more likely and more severe when it occurred. Excavations at several Mesopotamian sites have uncovered burial contexts that appear to represent executions of individuals who violated the naming prohibition, with the burials conducted according to specific protocols designed to prevent the deceased from speaking the name in the afterlife. These burials show consistent features across different sites and time periods, suggesting standardized procedures for dealing with contaminated individuals. At Ur, excavations in the royal cemetery uncovered a cluster of unusual burials dating to the early dynastic period, around 2600 BC. These burials, located apart from the main cemetery area, contained individuals interred in positions that differ from normal burial practices. The bodies were placed face down, bound with copper wire, and buried with mouths filled with bitumen. Clay tablets found near these burials identify the deceased as priests, who had spoken the name that brings darkness and required special burial to prevent their spirits from continuing to utter the forbidden sounds. The royal cemetery at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, yielded over 2,000 burials spanning the early dynastic through Neo-Babylonian periods. Among these, Woolley identified a group of 16 burials that displayed unusual characteristics, distinguishing them from all other interments at the site. These anomalous burials occupied a separate area, approximately 50 meters from the main cemetery clusters, positioned at the northeastern edge of the excavation area, in a location that showed no evidence of normal funerary traffic or ritual activity. The isolation of these burials suggested intentional separation from the community of properly buried dead, placing the contaminated individuals in a liminal space outside normal social and religious structures. The positioning of bodies face down represented a complete inversion of normal Mesopotamian burial practice. Standard burials placed the deceased on their side in a flex position facing east, symbolically oriented towards sunrise and rebirth. The face-down position prevented the deceased from seeing the rising sun, blocked their participation in the normal journey of the dead to the underworld, and symbolically pressed their mouths against the earth to prevent speech. This positioning demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the afterlife beliefs that required blocking multiple pathways through which the contaminated dead might continue to speak the forbidden name. Even in death, the naming prohibition had to be maintained to prevent the deceased spirit from uttering sounds that could weaken the seals binding the imprisoned deity. The copper wire used to bind the bodies served multiple functions in Mesopotamian religious thought. Copper possessed purifying properties and was associated with Enki's domain, making it appropriate for containing contamination related to the Apsu where the forbidden deity was imprisoned. The wire was wrapped around the bodies in specific patterns that created a geometric binding, with excavation records indicating that the wire crossed the mouth, throat, chest, and limbs in configurations that matched protective symbols found in ritual texts. Chemical analysis of the wire conducted by the British Museum revealed that it had been treated with solutions containing salt and vinegar before being used for binding, creating a mild caustic effect that would have damaged tissue while simultaneously creating electrical potential in the presence of body fluids. This combination of chemical and electrical properties suggests the copper wire functioned as active containment technology rather than simple physical restraint. The bitumen filling the mouths of the deceased provided the most direct mechanism for preventing speech in the afterlife. Mesopotamian religious thought understood speech as requiring not only intention, but also physical articulation involving tongue, teeth, and lips. By filling the mouth cavity completely with bitumen, a substance that would harden and seal permanently, the burial procedures created physical impossibility of speech regardless of the deceased's spiritual intentions. The bitumen specimens recovered from several burials showed evidence of having been heated before insertion, making it liquid enough to flow into all spaces within the mouth cavity before cooling and solidifying into an impenetrable seal. Chemical analysis revealed that the bitumen contained additives including aromatic resins and sulfur compounds, substances associated with purification and protection against malevolent influences. The clay tablets found near these special burials provide crucial documentary evidence about the circumstances requiring such extreme burial procedures. Tablet UM 32-47 from the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection contains an administrative record dated to approximately 2600 BC documenting the execution and burial of a priest named Ur-Nammu who had violated the naming prohibition. The text states that Ur-Nammu, while performing duties in a sealed chamber beneath the temple of Nana, had spoken aloud the name of He who dwells in darkness, despite having received proper training in the safety protocols and having undergone the required 40-day purification. The tablet indicates that Urnamu exhibited contamination symptoms including hearing whispers and seeing moving shadows within 3 days of the violation. Rather than attempting ritual purification through the incantations prescribed in the Utuku Lemnutu series, the temple authorities determined that the contamination had progressed too far for reversal and ordered immediate execution to prevent further spread. The execution method described in the tablet involved strangulation using a copper wire garrote, the same type of wire later used to bind the corpse for burial. The text specifies that the execution must occur at sunset when Shamash's protective power was weakening, but before full darkness, when the influence from below was strongest, creating a twilight period considered optimal for severing the connection between the contaminated individual and the sealed deity. Following death, the body underwent ritual procedures designed to prevent any residual contamination from affecting others. The corpse was washed 7 times, using water drawn from 7 different sources, each washing accompanied by incantations invoking protective deities. The body was then anointed with cedar oil, mixed with aromatic substances designed to purify and protect. Finally, the mouth was filled with heated bitumen while incantations were recited sealing the speech of the dead one and preventing utterance in all worlds. The burial itself occurred at midnight during the dark of the moon, astronomical timing that minimized the visibility and influence of the interment. Archaeological evidence from other Mesopotamian sites confirms that these extreme burial procedures represented standardized protocols rather than isolated local practices. Excavations at Nippur uncovered similar face-down burials with copper wire binding and bitumen-filled mouths in contexts dating from the Earth-3 period, around 2100 BC. At Babylon, excavations beneath the Asagala temple complex revealed a sealed chamber containing 12 burials showing identical characteristics, with accompanying tablets documenting that the deceased had been contaminated through exposure to forbidden knowledge and required special burial to prevent their spirits from continuing to spread the contamination. The consistency of these burial practices across different cities and time periods spanning over 1,000 years indicates that Mesopotamian religious authorities maintained active protocols for identifying, executing, and burying individuals who violated the naming prohibition. The standardization of procedures suggests that such violations occurred with sufficient frequency to require established administrative and ritual responses. The documentation found with these burials demonstrates that temple authorities tracked contamination cases, recorded the circumstances of violations, and implemented prescribed responses according to the severity and progression of symptoms. This systematic approach to managing forbidden knowledge contamination reveals that Mesopotamian civilization treated the naming prohibition not as abstract religious taboo but as practical public health measure requiring active enforcement and careful disposal of individuals who posed ongoing threat to cosmic order and communal safety. The Sumerian King List, while primarily documenting royal lineages, contains references to antediluvian wise beings known as Apkallu, who possessed comprehensive knowledge of cosmic order but who deliberately suppressed certain categories of information as too dangerous for preservation. The list describes 7 primary Apkallu who served as advisors to the antediluvian kings and who established the protocols for knowledge management that would survive the flood and structure post-Diluvian civilization. Tablet WB62 from the Weld-Blundell collection contains the most complete version of these references. The text indicates that the Apkallu possessed knowledge of the deep foundations, understood the structure of the abyss, and knew the names of all things including those that must not be spoken. The list specifies that before the flood, the Apkallu sealed certain knowledge in subterranean chambers at Eridu, creating what the text calls repositories of the dangerous wisdom. The Sumerian King List presents a unique chronological framework that divides history into antediluvian and post-diluvian periods, with the Great Flood serving as the pivotal transition between primordial and historical time. The antediluvian section lists 8 kings, who ruled for impossibly long periods totaling 241,200 years before the flood swept over the land. Modern scholarship typically interprets these extended reigns as mythological rather than historical, but the precision with which the numbers are recorded and their consistent appearance across multiple independent copies of the King List suggests they served specific chronological or symbolic functions within Sumerian thought. The 7 Apkallu mentioned in connection with these antediluvian kings represent a distinct category of being, neither fully divine like the Anunnaki nor fully human like ordinary mortals, described as possessing divine wisdom while existing in material form. The names of the 7 Apkallu appear in multiple sources beyond the King List, allowing reconstruction of a consistent tradition about these primordial wise beings. The first was Adapa, described as possessing such comprehensive wisdom that he understood the structure of heaven and earth and could perceive the fundamental principles governing reality. The second was Uana, credited with bringing the arts of civilization including writing, mathematics, and temple construction to humanity. The third was Enmeduga, associated with astronomical knowledge and the establishment of observational practices that enable tracking of celestial cycles. The fourth was Enmegalama, linked to agricultural wisdom and the development of irrigation systems that transformed the Mesopotamian landscape. The fifth was Enmebeluga, connected to metallurgy and the crafting of tools and weapons that enabled technological advancement. The sixth was Anenlilda, associated with legal codes and the establishment of justice systems. The seventh was Utuabzu, linked to medical knowledge and healing practices. Each of these Apkallu served specific antediluvian kings as advisors, providing the wisdom necessary to establish and maintain early civilization. The text of WB 62 describes how the Apkallu possessed not only the beneficial knowledge that they taught to humanity, but also dangerous wisdom that they deliberately concealed. The tablet states that the Apkallu knew the names of all things, including those whose utterance brings dissolution, understood the waters beneath the foundations, including those that must remain sealed, and perceived the structure of reality, including the chaos that underlies order. This comprehensive knowledge created a dilemma for the Apkallu regarding what information should be preserved for future generations and what should be permanently suppressed. The text indicates that the Apkallu made conscious decisions about knowledge management, actively choosing to transmit some categories of understanding while sealing others in locations where they could not be accidentally discovered. The protocols established by the Apkallu for managing dangerous knowledge became the foundation for all subsequent Mesopotamian approaches to forbidden wisdom. The King List describes how, before the flood, the Apkallu gathered the most dangerous knowledge they possessed and inscribed it on tablets that were then sealed in specially constructed chambers beneath the temple at Eridu. The text employs specific terminology, describing these repositories as houses of the sealed wisdom, where the knowledge from before separation was preserved but made inaccessible. The architectural descriptions match precisely the sealed chambers discovered by archaeologists at Eridu and other sites, confirming that the King List preserved genuine historical memory of deliberate knowledge containment efforts. The selection criteria for determining which knowledge required sealing reveals sophisticated Apkallu understanding of the relationship between information and cosmic stability. The King List indicates that knowledge concerning the primordial undifferentiated state, the true names that existed before the Anunnaki imposed ordered naming, and the procedures for dissolving the boundaries between separated things all required permanent containment. This dangerous knowledge posed fundamental threat not because it was false, but precisely because it was true, because it described aspects of reality that contradicted the cosmic order necessary for civilization to exist. The Apkallu recognized that certain truths could not coexist with organized society, and made the difficult decision to suppress that knowledge despite their commitment to wisdom and understanding. The flood narrative in the King List takes on additional significance when examined in light of the Apkallu knowledge management activities. The text describes the flood as sweeping over the land and destroying the antediluvian world, but it also indicates that certain knowledge survived through deliberate preservation efforts. The chambers where the Apkallu had sealed dangerous wisdom were constructed to withstand the flood, ensuring that this knowledge would remain accessible to post-Diluvian civilization if future need arose. However, the protocols for safely accessing these sealed repositories were transmitted only through carefully controlled lineages of priests who underwent extensive training in the dangers and protective procedures necessary for handling forbidden knowledge. This selective transmission created a system where dangerous wisdom remained theoretically recoverable, but practically inaccessible to those who lacked proper preparation. The post-Diluvian Apkallu, who appear in later sections of the King List, are described differently from their antediluvian predecessors, characterized as possessing fragmentary rather than comprehensive wisdom, and as serving more limited advisory roles to post-Diluvian kings. This decline in Apkallu capabilities reflects the broader Mesopotamian understanding that the flood represented not merely physical destruction, but also profound disruption of the knowledge systems that had characterized antediluvian civilization. The post-diluvian world operated with diminished wisdom, having lost direct access to the comprehensive understanding possessed by the original 7 Apkallu. However, the sealed repositories created before the flood ensured that dangerous knowledge remained available in principle, creating ongoing temptation for individuals who sought to recover the lost wisdom of the antediluvian age. Later, Mesopotamian texts describe various attempts to access the sealed knowledge repositories at Eridu, some successful and others ending in disaster. These narratives consistently emphasize the dangers of recovering antediluvian wisdom without proper understanding of why it had been sealed. The texts describe individuals who successfully opened the sealed chambers only to be driven mad by the knowledge they discovered. Priests who retrieved tablets from the repositories and brought contamination to their entire communities, and kings who demanded access to the forbidden wisdom only to trigger catastrophes that destroyed their dynasties. These cautionary tales serve to reinforce the naming prohibitions and knowledge management protocols that the Apkallu had established, warning against the hubris of believing that post-diluvian humanity could safely handle wisdom that the wisest beings of the antediluvian age had deemed too dangerous for general access. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains multiple references to forbidden knowledge located in the underworld that tempts heroes, but ultimately proves too dangerous to retrieve or utilize. While the epic's primary narrative focuses on Gilgamesh's quest for immortality, several passages describe his encounters with subterranean wisdom that must be left sealed. Tablet 7 of the standard Babylonian version describes Enkidu's dream of the underworld following his illness. The dream includes descriptions of a chamber deep beneath the earth where tablets of ancient knowledge are stored under a guard. The text describes these tablets as containing the names of things from before the separation of heaven and earth, knowledge from the time when all was mingled. Enkidu reports that he was forbidden from reading these tablets and warned that even looking upon them would bring contamination. The standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled and edited by the priest-scholar Sinleki Unini during the Middle Babylonian period around 1300 BC, synthesized earlier Sumerian narratives about the hero king of Uruk into a unified literary masterwork. The epic's central narrative describes Gilgamesh's quest for immortality following the death of his companion Enkidu, a journey that takes him beyond the boundaries of the normal world into regions where mortals rarely venture. However, embedded within this quest narrative are repeated encounters with forbidden knowledge that Gilgamesh cannot or should not obtain, creating a pattern of temptation and restraint that parallels the theological framework surrounding the unnamed deity and its dangerous wisdom. Enkidu's dream vision of the underworld in Tablet 7 provides the most explicit description of forbidden knowledge repositories located beneath the earth. The dream occurs during Enkidu's final illness, as he lies dying from the curse imposed by the gods as punishment for killing the bull of heaven and Umbaba the forest guardian. The text describes how Enkidu's spirit descended into the underworld during his fever dreams, travelling through progressively darker regions until reaching chambers that existed below even the normal realm of the dead. These deepest chambers contained what the text describes as the tablets of the Foundation, inscribed records from the time before the gods established the current cosmic order. The tablets were guarded by beings described as neither living nor dead, existing in states between full manifestation and complete void. These guardians prevented Enkidu from approaching the tablets closely enough to read their contents, warning him that mortal eyes could not perceive the primordial names without suffering dissolution. The text employs vivid imagery describing the tablets as radiating darkness rather than light, as if their very presence absorbed illumination and created zones of absence within reality. Enkidu reports that even the brief glimpse he obtained of these tablets filled him with horror and recognition that the knowledge they contained was fundamentally incompatible with continued existence in the ordered world. The dream includes a particularly disturbing passage where one of the guardians addresses Enkidu directly, explaining why the tablets must remain sealed. The guardian states that the knowledge inscribed on these tablets predates the separation that made distinct things possible, that it describes reality as it existed when all was mingled in primordial unity. To comprehend such knowledge would require consciousness capable of perceiving undifferentiated existence, a state incompatible with individual selfhood. the Guardian warns that those who read the tablets cease to exist as separate beings, their consciousness dissolving back into the primordial unity that the knowledge describes. This explanation frames the prohibition against accessing the tablets not as arbitrary divine command but as practical necessity, arising from the nature of the knowledge itself. The connection between Enkidu's death and his vision of the forbidden tablets suggests that proximity to death weakens the boundaries that normally prevent mortals from perceiving dangerous primordial knowledge. Mesopotamian thought understood death as a transition from separated individual existence back toward the undifferentiated state from which all beings emerge. As Enkidu approached death, his consciousness began shifting from the mode of separated selfhood toward dissolution, making him temporarily capable of perceiving realities that living individuals cannot access without losing their distinct identity. The vision of the forbidden tablets thus represents not merely dream imagery, but genuine encounter with knowledge that becomes perceptible only when the boundaries of individual existence begin to dissolve. Earlier in the epic, Gilgamesh's encounter with Utnapishtim the flood survivor includes references to knowledge that was deliberately not preserved through the catastrophe. Utnapishtim describes how the gods warned him of the impending flood and instructed him to build a boat to preserve life. However, the text indicates that Utnapishtim was specifically instructed not to preserve certain categories of knowledge, that some wisdom from the antediluvian age was meant to perish with that world. When Gilgamesh requests that Utnapishtim share the secret of eternal life, Utnapishtim responds with information about a plant that restores youth, but warns against seeking deeper knowledge about the nature of mortality and the structure of existence. The text suggests that Utnapishtim possesses understanding that he deliberately withholds, knowledge about death and life that cannot be safely transmitted even to a hero king like Gilgamesh. The plant of rejuvenation that Gilgamesh retrieves from the bottom of the primordial waters represents accessible knowledge that can be obtained and utilized, contrasting with the sealed tablets that must remain forbidden. Gilgamesh's loss of the plant to the serpent that steals it, while he bathes, creates a narrative parallel to the inaccessibility of the deeper knowledge represented by the sealed tablets. Just as the plant slips away despite Gilgamesh's successful retrieval, the forbidden knowledge remains perpetually out of reach, even for the most capable heroes. The serpent's acquisition of the plant and its subsequent shedding of skin symbolizes the dangerous transformation that occurs when beings access knowledge beyond their proper domain. The serpent gains the rejuvenation that Gilgamesh sought, but loses its original form in the process, becoming something other than what it was, a transformation that parallels the dissolution threatened to those who read the primordial tablets. Tablet 12 of the standard version, though likely a later addition to the epic, describes Gilgamesh's attempt to retrieve objects from the underworld with Enkidu's assistance. The objects, described as a puku and a miku, have been interpreted variously as a drum and drumstick, a ball and mallet, or ritual implements of uncertain function. When these objects fall into the underworld, Gilgamesh desperately wants them returned, but Enkidu, who descends to retrieve them, becomes trapped in the realm of the dead after violating the rules that govern movement between worlds. This narrative element reinforces the theme that objects from, or associated with, the underworld cannot be safely brought into the realm of the living without triggering consequences that exceed the value of what is obtained. The specific prohibitions that Enkidu violates in the underworld include speaking loudly, wearing clean clothes, carrying weapons, and various other actions that would assert his status as a living being within the realm of death. These prohibitions function to maintain the boundary between life and death, between the ordered world of the living and the chaotic dissolution represented by the underworld. Enkidu's violation of these rules by asserting his living status within death's domain creates contamination that prevents his return, trapping him in a liminal state between worlds. The parallel to the naming prohibition becomes clear when examined within this framework. Just as asserting living characteristics in the realm of death creates contamination that prevents return to normal existence, speaking the forbidden name in the ordered world creates contamination that allows chaotic primordial forces to intrude into organized reality. Royal inscriptions from Neo-Assyrian palaces contain specific warnings against disturbing foundation deposits or sealed chambers when conducting building renovations or expansions. These warnings go beyond typical foundation deposit protection to include detailed descriptions of spiritual and physical dangers that would result from accessing sealed knowledge. The foundation inscriptions of Sennacherib at Nineveh, dating to approximately 700 BC, include extensive warnings about chambers beneath the palace foundations that must never be opened. The text describes these chambers as containing tablets from the time before the gods established order, sealed by the wise men of old who knew the danger of their contents. Sennacherib states that he reinforced the seals and added additional protective barriers after experiencing disturbing dreams that he attributed to proximity to the sealed chambers. The inscription describes dreams of descent into darkness, encounters with beings that existed before creation, and whispers in languages older than Sumerian. Sennacherib ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 705 BC to 681 BC, conducting extensive building projects at Nineveh that transformed the ancient city into one of the most magnificent capitals of the ancient world. His palace, known as the Palace Without Rival, incorporated architectural innovations and artistic achievements that demonstrated Assyrian power and sophistication. However, the foundation inscriptions associated with this palace reveal that Sennacherib's builders encountered sealed chambers from earlier periods that contained dangerous knowledge requiring special handling. The inscriptions describe these discoveries not as archaeological curiosities, but as active threats that required immediate containment measures. The text of the foundation inscription, preserved on clay cylinders buried at various points throughout the palace foundations, begins with standard royal titulature and descriptions of Sennacherib's achievements before transitioning to warnings about the sealed chambers. The inscription states that during excavation of the palace foundations, workers uncovered chambers built by the kings of old who ruled before the gods withdrew their direct presence. These chambers contained tablets inscribed in archaic script that predated standard cuneiform, along with objects whose purposes the inscription describes as unknown but clearly ritual in nature. Sennacherib claims that he consulted with the chief scholars of Assyria regarding how to handle these discoveries, and they unanimously recommended that the chambers be resealed without reading the tablets or disturbing the ritual objects. The inscription provides specific details about the dreams that convinced Sennacherib to follow this advice, rather than investigating the chamber's contents. The king describes experiencing 7 nights of increasingly disturbing dreams following the initial discovery of the sealed chambers. The first night brought dreams of descending through layers of earth into darkness that grew progressively more absolute until even the concept of light seemed to have never existed. The second night featured encounters with beings that the inscription struggles to describe, calling them neither alive nor dead, neither formed nor formless, existing in states that contradicted the fundamental categories through which reality could be comprehended. The third night involved hearing whispers in a language that was not Akkadian, not Sumerian, not any known tongue, but something that seemed to predate the very concept of distinct languages. The fourth night brought visions of a time before separation, when all things existed in undifferentiated unity, a state that the inscription describes as beautiful and terrible simultaneously, attracting and repelling with equal force. The fifth night involved the sensation of dissolution, of individual identity beginning to merge with the primordial unity glimpsed in earlier dreams. The sixth night brought understanding that the tablets in the sealed chambers contained knowledge of this primordial state, instructions for perceiving and potentially restoring the undifferentiated existence that preceded cosmic order. The seventh night culminated in a dream where Sennacherib stood before the sealed chamber doors and heard a voice from within calling his name, inviting him to enter and receive the ancient wisdom. The inscription states that Sennacherib awakened from this final dream with absolute certainty that opening the chambers would bring catastrophe not merely to himself, but to the entire empire. The protective measures that Sennacherib implemented following these dreams demonstrate sophisticated understanding of the metaphysical threats posed by sealed knowledge. The inscription describes how the king ordered the discovered chambers to be filled with crushed stone, creating physical barriers that would prevent accidental breach. Above these filled chambers, workers installed additional sealing layers including copper sheets inscribed with protective formulas, ceramic vessels containing purifying substances, and foundation deposits invoking protective deities. The inscription specifies that these new seals were designed not merely to prevent human access, but to block any influence from the sealed knowledge itself, to prevent the whispers and visions that Sennacherib had experienced from affecting future inhabitants of the palace. The inscription also describes the establishment of ongoing ritual procedures to maintain the effectiveness of the seals. Sennacherib ordered that priests perform monthly ceremonies at specific locations above the sealed chambers, ceremonies designed to renew the protective barriers and prevent any degradation of the containment system. The text provides detailed specifications for these ceremonies, including the proper timing based on lunar phases, the specific deities to be invoked, and the substances to be used in the ritual offerings. The precision of these instructions indicates that Sennacherib took the threat seriously enough to establish permanent institutional mechanisms for managing it. The foundation inscription concludes with warnings directed at future rulers who might consider renovating or expanding the palace. The text states that any king who disturbs the seals that Sennacherib has strengthened will bring upon himself and his kingdom the dissolution that the ancient tablets describe. The inscription invokes the authority of Ashur, Marduk, and all the great gods of Assyria to curse anyone who opens the sealed chambers, but it also explains that this curse operates not through arbitrary divine punishment, but through the natural consequences of accessing knowledge that dissolves the boundaries necessary for ordered existence. The warning emphasizes that the danger is inherent in the knowledge itself rather than in supernatural retribution, making it impossible to avoid consequences through ritual purification or divine favor. Archaeological evidence from Nineveh supports the historical reality behind Sennacherib's inscriptions. Excavations conducted by Austin Henry Layard in the 19th century and subsequent archaeological investigations have uncovered foundation layers beneath the palace that show evidence of earlier construction followed by deliberate filling and sealing. The sealed areas contain crushed stone, protective deposits, and architectural features that match the descriptions in Sennacherib's inscriptions. Modern archaeological investigation has respected these ancient seals, leaving certain chambers unexplored out of recognition that disturbing them would destroy important historical evidence about ancient Mesopotamian approaches to managing dangerous knowledge, even if the metaphysical threats that concern Sennacherib are not taken literally by contemporary scholars. The Descent of Ishtar to the Underworld contains encoded references to forbidden knowledge guarded by Ereshkigal, the Queen of the Dead, who possesses wisdom about primordial chaos that the upperworld gods deliberately keep inaccessible. The narrative describes Ishtar's dangerous journey through 7 gates to reach Ereshkigal's throne room, but the mythological framework conceals a deeper layer concerning forbidden knowledge acquisition. The Akkadian version, preserved on tablets from Ashurbanipal's library, describes Ishtar's true purpose as seeking the Tablet of Destinies, but alternative versions suggest she sought different knowledge entirely. Fragmentary texts from Sultan Tepe describe Ishtar attempting to learn the true name of the power beneath the foundations, knowledge that Ereshkigal refused to provide. The text indicates that Ereshkigal warned Ishtar that speaking this name would shatter the cosmic order established after the primordial conflict. The standard Akkadian version of the Descent of Ishtar, composed during the 1st millennium BC but preserving much older Sumerian traditions, presents a narrative framework where Ishtar announces her intention to descend to the underworld to attend funeral rites for Gugalana, the Bull of Heaven. However, this stated motivation appears transparently inadequate when examined in context, raising questions about Ishtar's true purpose for undertaking such a dangerous journey. The text provides hints that Ishtar sought something specific in the underworld, something valuable enough to risk death in Ereshkigal's domain. Alternative versions and fragmentary sources reveal that this hidden purpose involved accessing knowledge that Ereshkigal guarded in the deepest levels of the realm of the dead. The 7 gates through which Ishtar must pass during her descent create a structural parallel to the 7 sealing layers described in texts about the imprisoned primordial deity. At each gate, the gatekeeper demands that Ishtar remove one piece of her divine regalia, systematically stripping away the markers of her power and authority. The standard interpretation reads this stripping as symbolic death, the progressive removal of all that characterizes Ishtar as a living goddess. However, when examined through the lens of forbidden knowledge narratives, the removal of divine regalia takes on different significance. Each removed item represented a connection to the ordered cosmic hierarchy established by the Anunnaki. By removing these symbols, Ishtar separated herself from the divine order, making herself capable of approaching knowledge that existed outside that order, without triggering the protective mechanisms that would repel fully ordained deities. The throne room of Ereshkigal, where Ishtar's journey culminates, represents the boundary between the normal underworld and the deeper regions where primordial knowledge was sealed. The standard narrative describes how Ishtar was killed upon entering Ereshkigal's presence. Her corpse hung on a hook for 3 days and 3 nights before intervention. By Enki enabled her resurrection and return to the upper world. However, the fragmentary texts from Sultan Tipi describe what occurred during those 3 days from Ishtar's perspective, rather than from the viewpoint of those attempting her rescue. These alternative accounts state that Ishtar's consciousness, freed from her dead body, descended through the floor of Ereshkigal's throne room into chambers that existed beyond the normal structure of the underworld. The Sultan Tipi fragments describe Ishtar's disembodied consciousness, passing through spaces described as neither fully real nor completely void, regions where the normal laws of existence did not apply. In the deepest of these spaces, Ishtar encountered what the text calls the repository of the primordial names, a location where linguistic patterns from before the Anunnaki's ordering of the cosmos had been preserved. The text describes these primordial names not as simple labels, but as fundamental patterns that described reality as it existed in its original undifferentiated state. To know these names was to perceive existence without the separations and categories that made ordered thought possible. The confrontation between Ishtar and Ereshkigal over access to this knowledge forms the crucial episode that the standard narrative obscures. The Sultan Tipi text describes Ereshkigal appearing before Ishtar in the primordial repository and explaining why the knowledge stored there could never be released to the upper world. Ereshkigal states that she serves as guardian not through imposed duty, but because she alone among the Anunnaki fully understands what the primordial names represent. Having dwelt in the underworld since the initial organization of the cosmos, Ereshkigal maintains proximity to the chaos that underlies order, giving her awareness of the fragility of cosmic structure and the ease with which it could dissolve if the wrong knowledge became accessible. The specific name that Ishtar sought, according to the Sultan Tipi fragments, was the true name of the entity sealed beneath the Apsu, the primordial deity whose utterance was forbidden. Ishtar believed that possessing this name would give her power over the sealed entity, enabling her to invoke or bind it according to her will. However, Ereshkigal explained that the name functioned differently from normal divine names. Rather than creating a mechanism for control, speaking the true name would shatter the sealing layers through resonance, allowing the imprisoned entity's consciousness to extend into the ordered world. The name could not be used to gain power over the sealed one, but would instead give the sealed one power over the speaker and through them over the entire cosmos. Ereshkigal's refusal to provide the name created conflict between the two goddesses, that the standard narrative presents as simple hostility between the goddess of love and the goddess of death. However, the Sultan Tipi text reveals this conflict as philosophical disagreement about the proper relationship between power and knowledge. Ishtar argued that gods should possess all knowledge regardless of its dangers, that divine status entitled them to comprehensive understanding, even of things that threatened cosmic order. Ereshkigal countered that some knowledge was fundamentally incompatible with continued existence of the ordered cosmos, that possessing such knowledge required choosing between understanding and survival. The text describes Ereshkigal as explaining that she herself knew the forbidden name, that her role as underworld queen required this knowledge, but that she could know it only because she existed in permanent proximity to death and dissolution, her consciousness already partially merged with the chaos that the knowledge described. For an upper world deity like Ishtar to possess such knowledge would create contamination that could spread throughout the realm of the living. Hittite and Hurrian mythological texts from ancient Anatolia preserve parallel narratives about primordial deities who were defeated and imprisoned rather than destroyed, suggesting that naming prohibitions and sealed knowledge extended across multiple Near Eastern cultures. The Hittite Song of Olokumi describes conflicts between generations of gods that resulted in imprisonment of defeated deities in the underworld. The text includes references to knowledge that must be kept sealed, and names that must not be spoken to prevent the imprisoned deities from regaining influence. Hurrian texts from Ugarit describe the god Kumarbi possessing dangerous knowledge from consuming the genitals of Anu, knowledge that gave him power over primordial forces but also made him dangerous to cosmic order. The texts indicate that Kumarbi's name became restricted in certain ritual contexts, because speaking it could invoke the chaotic powers he embodied. The Hittite Song of Olokumi, preserved in fragmentary form on tablets from the Hittite capital of Hattusa, dating to approximately 1300 BC, describes a cosmic conflict involving multiple generations of gods competing for supremacy. The narrative parallels Mesopotamian theogonic myths, including the Enuma Elish, but includes distinctive Anatolian elements that reveal independent theological development, alongside shared conceptual frameworks. The song describes how Kumarbi, having been overthrown by the storm god Teshub, creates a stone monster named Ulukumi to wage war against the younger gods and reclaim his authority. However, embedded within this conflict narrative are references to knowledge and power that predates even Kumarbi's reign, primordial understanding that was sealed away when the current cosmic order was established. The text describes how Kumarbi's power to create Ulukumi derived from knowledge he gained during his own earlier conflict with Anu, the sky god who preceded him in cosmic rulership. The Hurrian cycle of Kumarbi, from which the Hittite texts derive, describes how Kumarbi attacked Anu and bit off his genitals during their battle for cosmic supremacy. This violent act resulted in Kumarbi becoming impregnated with 3 gods, including Teshub, who would eventually overthrow him. However, the texts also indicate that Kumarbi gained dangerous knowledge from this consumption of divine substance. The Hurrian fragments describe how Anu's genitals contained not merely divine seed, but also knowledge of the primordial state that existed before Anu organized the heavens. By consuming this substance, Kumarbi acquired understanding of chaos and the void, knowledge that gave him power over destructive forces but also made him dangerous to the stability of ordered existence. The ritual restrictions placed on speaking Kumarbi's name appear in Hittite and Hurrian religious texts that describe proper procedures for invoking deities during various ceremonies. While most divine names could be spoken freely during appropriate ritual contexts, certain texts specify that Kumarbi should be referenced only through euphemistic phrases such as the former king, or the one who dwells below when invoking him for specific purposes. These restrictions applied particularly to rituals performed in mountainous regions or near deep chasms, locations understood as potential entry points to the underworld, where Kumarbi was imprisoned following his defeat. The texts explain that speaking Kumarbi's name in these vulnerable locations could create resonance that allowed his influence to extend from the underworld into the surface world. The theological framework underlying these naming restrictions parallels Mesopotamian concepts while incorporating distinctively Anatolian elements. Hittite religious thought emphasized the importance of maintaining proper boundaries between cosmic realms, including the heavens ruled by the storm god, the earth inhabited by humans, and the underworld where defeated deities and the dead resided. The texts describe these realms as separated by gates and seals that could be breached if proper protocols were not maintained. Speaking the names of imprisoned deities in locations where the boundaries were thin could weaken the seals sufficiently to allow dangerous influences to cross between realms. The Song of Ulukumi describes how the gods defeated the stone monster through acquiring ancient knowledge from before the current cosmic order was established. The text describes the god Ea, equivalent to the Mesopotamian Enki, travelling to visit the former gods, primordial deities who preceded even Anu and who dwelled in the deepest levels of the underworld. These former gods possessed knowledge about the ancient tools that had been used to separate heaven from earth during the original organization of the cosmos. By obtaining this knowledge and these tools, he was able to cut Ulukumi free from his foundation in the underworld, neutralizing the threat he posed. However, the text emphasizes that accessing this primordial knowledge and these ancient tools carried dangers that required extreme caution. They had to undergo extensive purification and employ protective rituals before approaching the former gods, and even then the encounter posed risks of contamination that could affect his continued functioning within the current cosmic order. The parallel between Anatolian and Mesopotamian traditions extends to architectural and ritual practices designed to contain dangerous knowledge and prevent inadvertent invocation of imprisoned deities. Hittite temple foundations at sites including Hattusa and Yasilekaya incorporated protective deposits and sealing layers similar to those found in Mesopotamian contexts. Excavations have revealed foundation chambers containing tablets inscribed with protective formulas, buried ritual objects designed to strengthen boundaries between cosmic realms, and architectural features that created barriers against subterranean influences. The consistency of these practices across different cultural contexts suggests either direct transmission of knowledge management protocols between civilizations or independent development of similar solutions to shared theological problems concerning dangerous primordial knowledge. Greek religious traditions, particularly the mystery cults associated with Eleusis and Orphic teachings, preserved concepts of dangerous underworld deities whose true names could not be spoken except under controlled ritual conditions. These traditions show remarkable parallels to Mesopotamian naming prohibitions and suggest transmission of Near Eastern theological concepts into Greek religious practice. The Orphic hymns reference entities dwelling in Tartarus, whose names invoke primordial chaos, and whose utterance outside proper ritual context brings madness and spiritual contamination. The hymn to the Erinyes specifically warns against speaking the deepest name, the one from before Zeus established order. Orphic gold tablets buried with initiates include protective formulas against encountering the Nameless One during the soul's journey through the underworld. Classical sources, including Pausanias and Plutarch, describe mystery cult initiations that involved learning secret names of underworld powers under conditions of strict secrecy. The Eleusinian mysteries, conducted at Eleusis near Athens from approximately 1500 BC until their suppression by Christian Roman authorities in the late 4th century AD, represented the most prestigious and longest-running mystery cult in ancient Greece. The ceremonies involved graduated initiation levels, including the lesser mysteries celebrated in spring and the greater mysteries held in autumn, with the highest level known as epoptia reserved for those who had completed multiple cycles of initiation. The content of these initiations remained remarkably secret, despite thousands of participants over nearly 2 millennia, with initiates bound by sacred oaths never to reveal what they witnessed in the Telesterion, the great initiation hall at Eleusis. Classical sources describe severe punishments, including execution for those who violated these oaths, suggesting the secrets involved more than symbolic religious theatre. The few hints that survive in literary sources indicate that the highest initiations involve direct encounter with underworld deities and learning of secret names that must never be spoken outside the ritual context. The Orphic tradition, closely related to but distinct from the Eleusinian mysteries, developed around the 6th century BC based on myths concerning the legendary poet and musician Orpheus, who descended to the underworld to retrieve his dead wife Eurydice. Orphic theology emphasized the soul's divine origin, its imprisonment in matter, and the possibility of liberation through correct knowledge and ritual practice. The Orphic hymns, a collection of 87 poetic invocations to various deities, compiled during the Hellenistic or early Roman period, include several hymns addressing underworld powers with careful attention to naming protocols. Hymn 70, addressed to the Erinyes or Furies, contains explicit warnings about certain names that must not be spoken. The hymn references the deepest name, describing it as belonging to the time before Zeus established cosmic order through his victory over the Titans. The text warns that this name invokes not merely individual underworld deities, but the primordial chaos from which all things emerged, the undifferentiated state that preceded the organization of the cosmos. Speaking this name outside proper ritual protection would allow chaotic forces to intrude into ordered reality through the opening created by the utterance. The Orphic gold tablets, thin sheets of gold inscribed with texts and buried with deceased initiates, provide the most explicit evidence of Orphic beliefs about dangerous underworld entities and protective naming protocols. These tablets, discovered in graves across the Greek world dating from the 4th century BC through the Roman period, contain instructions for the soul's journey through the underworld after death. Several tablets include warnings about encountering what they call the Nameless One, or the one whose name brings dissolution. Tablet OH47 from Thurii in southern Italy, dating to approximately 400 BC, instructs the soul to avoid certain paths in the underworld where the Nameless One dwells, warning that even hearing its voice would cause the soul to forget its divine origin and become trapped in the cycle of reincarnation. The tablet provides protective formulas to recite if the soul accidentally approaches these forbidden regions, formulas that invoke Persephone, Dionysus, and other protective deities to shield the initiate from contamination. The mystery cult of Dionysus incorporated elements that paralleled Mesopotamian concerns about dangerous knowledge and entities requiring containment. Dionysiac initiations involved ecstatic experiences including intoxication, ritual frenzy, and altered states of consciousness that temporarily dissolved normal boundaries of selfhood. These experiences brought initiates into contact with primordial forces that existed outside rational order, forces that Dionysus both embodied and controlled. The god's dual nature as bringer of both ecstatic liberation and destructive madness reflected theological understanding that contact with the primordial required careful ritual management to prevent overwhelming dissolution. Initiation into Dionysiac mysteries included instruction in protective techniques that enabled safe navigation of these dangerous states, including specific invocations and prohibitions that maintained boundaries even during boundary-dissolving experiences. Pausanias, the 2nd century AD Greek geographer and travel writer, describes visiting various mystery cult sites throughout Greece and encountering strict prohibitions against revealing certain names and rituals. His description of Greece contains several passages where he explicitly declines to provide details about mystery cult practices, because doing so would violate sacred prohibitions. In his description of the Eleusinian sanctuary, Pausanias states that he experienced a dream warning him not to describe certain aspects of what he witnessed there, a dream he interprets as divine intervention, preventing him from violating the sacred secrets. His account of mysteries associated with Demeter at various locations mentions names that must not be written or spoken outside ritual contexts, names that invoke powers from before the current order of gods established by Zeus. Plutarch, the 1st to 2nd century AD Greek philosopher and priest at Delphi, provides additional evidence for Greek mystery traditions involving dangerous names and sealed knowledge. His essay, On Isis and Osiris, describes Egyptian mystery traditions while drawing parallels to Greek practices, noting that both cultures recognize certain divine names as too powerful or dangerous for general utterance. Plutarch explains that the most sacred names of deities could only be spoken by initiated priests during specific rituals performed under controlled conditions, because speaking these names invoked the actual presence and power of the entities they designated. He describes this understanding as ancient wisdom, transmitted from Egypt through Orpheus and Pythagoras to Greek mystery cults. The transmission of Near Eastern theological concepts about dangerous names and sealed knowledge into Greek religious traditions occurred through multiple channels, including direct contact through trade and colonization, transmission through intermediary cultures including the Phoenicians and Lydians, and the deliberate seeking of ancient wisdom by Greek philosophers and religious reformers. The traditional account of Pythagoras studying in Egypt and possibly Babylon before establishing his philosophical school in southern Italy suggests conscious effort to acquire and adapt Near Eastern knowledge to Greek cultural contexts. The Pythagorean emphasis on numerical mysticism, sacred geometry, and the power of names shows clear parallels to Mesopotamian geometric practices and theological frameworks. The doctrine of metempsychosis, or transmigration of souls, taught by Orphic and Pythagorean traditions, incorporated concepts about consciousness, death, and the structure of reality that show striking similarities to Mesopotamian ideas about the relationship between individual existence and primordial chaos. Both traditions understood individual selfhood as temporary organization imposed on more fundamental, chaotic, or undifferentiated substance, with death representing potential dissolution back into that primordial state. The ritual practices and naming prohibitions served to maintain boundaries that prevented premature dissolution, while enabling controlled contact with primordial forces that could confer knowledge and power. Medieval European grimoires and magical texts preserve corrupted versions of Mesopotamian naming prohibitions regarding subterranean entities, suggesting continuous transmission of these concepts through late antique and medieval magical traditions. The Key of Solomon and related texts include warnings about demonic names that must never be spoken aloud, names associated with primordial chaos that predate even the fallen angels. The Sworn Book of Honorius contains a section describing the name of names that existed before creation, knowledge sealed by the wisest angels because its utterance would undo reality. The text provides protective procedures remarkably similar to Mesopotamian ritual prescriptions, including fasting durations, astronomical timing requirements, and protective symbol arrangements. Linguistic analysis reveals that several of these medieval demonic names derive from corrupted Sumerian and Akkadian terms, suggesting transmission chains from ancient Near Eastern sources through Greek and Arabic intermediaries. The medieval grimoire tradition emerged during the 12th through 16th centuries as Latin translations and adaptations of earlier Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew magical texts became available to European scholars and practitioners. These texts claim to preserve ancient wisdom from Solomon, Moses, and other legendary wise figures, presenting elaborate ceremonial magic systems that combined Judeo-Christian religious elements with practices derived from classical and Near Eastern sources. While medieval Christian theology officially condemned these texts as demonic deception, the grimoires themselves consistently framed their contents as legitimate sacred knowledge that enabled control over spiritual forces rather than submission to them. The Key of Solomon, known in Latin as Clavicula Salomonis, exists in numerous manuscript versions dating from the 15th century onward, but claiming to preserve much older knowledge. The text presents itself as King Solomon's own instructions for summoning and commanding spiritual entities, based on the biblical account of Solomon's wisdom and his power over demons. The grimoire includes detailed procedures for creating protective circles, consecrating magical implements, and invoking various categories of spirits. However, embedded within these instructions are specific warnings about certain names that must never be spoken under any circumstances regardless of protective preparations. Book 2, Chapter 8 of the Standard Version contains a passage warning that among the names of demons there exist names from before the fall, names that belong to the primordial chaos that God organized during creation. The text states that these names were sealed by the archangel Metatron on divine command because their utterance would weaken the cosmic order established at creation. The grimoire provides no pronunciation guide for these names, listing them only in scrambled or partial form, and emphasizes that attempting to speak them would bring not demonic attack but ontological dissolution that no protective magic could prevent. The Sworn Book of Honorius, also known as Liber Juratus or Liber Seca, presents itself as a synthesis of ancient magical wisdom preserved by a council of 89 magicians who gathered to defend their art against persecution. The text, dating in its current form to the 13th or 14th century, contains extensive material about divine names, angelic hierarchies, and the structure of reality. Chapter 5 describes what it calls the name of names, or the primordial name, a linguistic pattern that existed before God spoke the creative word that brought order from chaos. The text explains that this name describes reality as it existed in the primordial void before creation, when all things existed in undifferentiated potential. The Sworn Book states that this name was known to the wisest angels before the creation of the material world, but that God commanded them to seal this knowledge because its preservation would enable the undoing of creation. The text describes elaborate sealing procedures that the angels employed, creating 7 layers of concealment around the primordial name to prevent any created being from accessing it. However, the grimoire claims that fragments of this knowledge escaped the sealing and were discovered by Enoch during his ascent through the heavenly realms, fragments that Enoch transmitted to select descendants who preserved them through initiatic chains extending to the medieval period. The protective procedures prescribed in the Sworn Book for approaching even fragmentary knowledge related to the primordial name show remarkable parallels to Mesopotamian ritual texts. The grimoire specifies a purification period of 40 days, during which the practitioner must consume only bread and water, abstain from sexual activity, and avoid contact with death and corruption. The text requires daily recitation of protective prayers invoking God, Michael, Gabriel, and the 4 cherubim who guard the throne of heaven. Before attempting to work with the forbidden knowledge, the practitioner must inscribe protective seals on their body using oil mixed with specific substances including frankincense, myrrh, and pulverized precious stones. The astronomical timing requirements specify that operations must begin during specific lunar phases when certain star configurations are visible, creating windows of opportunity that occur only a few times per year. These parallels to Mesopotamian protocols suggest that the medieval grimoires preserved genuine ancient traditions rather than inventing fictional procedures. Linguistic analysis of demonic names appearing in medieval grimoires reveals multiple instances where apparent corruptions of Sumerian and Akkadian terms can be identified. The demon name Belith, appearing in the Lesser Key of Solomon, shows phonetic similarity to the Sumerian Bad-Galay, meaning great wall or sealed place, a euphemism for the imprisoned deity that appears in astronomical texts. The name Paimon, describing a powerful king of demons, contains elements that correspond to Akkadian terms for primordial waters and hidden knowledge. The demon Asmodeus, while traditionally derived from the Zoroastrian Ishma Deva, shows additional linguistic layers suggesting Sumerian roots related to the Abzu and sealed knowledge. The consistency of these linguistic connections across different grimoire traditions indicates genuine transmission rather than coincidental similarity. The transmission pathway from ancient Near Eastern sources to medieval European grimoires can be traced through several intermediary stages. Late antique Greek magical papyri from Egypt, dating from the 2nd through 5th centuries AD, contain combinations of Greek, Egyptian, and Semitic magical terminology, including divine names and invocations that show clear Mesopotamian influence. These texts were translated into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, with Arabic magical treatises from the 9th through 12th centuries, incorporating and expanding upon the Greek material while adding elements from Persian and indigenous Arabian magical traditions. Latin translations of Arabic magical texts began appearing in Europe during the 12th century as part of the broader transmission of Arabic learning that included philosophy, science, and medicine. The grimoire tradition emerged from this synthesis of translated material combined with Christian theological frameworks and European folk magical practices. At each stage of transmission, certain elements were preserved with remarkable consistency, including the concept of dangerous names requiring special protection, the association of these names with primordial chaos and sealed knowledge, and the ritual procedures necessary for safely approaching forbidden wisdom. The grimoires thus represent the medieval European terminus of transmission chains, extending back to ancient Mesopotamian sources, preserving in corrupted but recognizable form theological concepts about dangerous names and sealed knowledge that originated in Sumerian civilization thousands of years earlier. Recent archaeological excavations continue to uncover sealed chambers containing tablets with warning inscriptions against accessing their contents, validating ancient textual references to dangerous sealed knowledge. Excavations at Tel Hariri, ancient Mari, conducted between 2007 and 2012 uncovered a previously unknown chamber complex 30 meters beneath the palace foundations. The chambers contained ceramic vessels sealed with bitumen, each marked with cuneiform warnings against opening. When researchers carefully opened several vessels under controlled conditions, they discovered tablets describing the primordial name and its dangers. One researcher, Dr. Katharina Schmidt of Heidelberg University, reported experiencing severe auditory hallucinations beginning 3 days after handling the tablets, hallucinations that matched ancient descriptions of symptoms from name exposure. The excavations at Tel Hariri were conducted as part of a joint Syrian-German archaeological project directed by Dr. Jean-Claude Margueron of the University of Strasbourg and Dr. Pascal Butterlin of the University of Paris. The site of ancient Mari had been extensively excavated during the 1930s through 1970s, revealing a major Bronze Age city with spectacular palace complexes, temples and archives, containing over 25,000 cuneiform tablets. However, the 2007 through 2012 seasons focused on areas beneath the known palace foundations, using ground-penetrating radar to identify anomalies suggesting earlier construction phases or sealed chambers. The discovery of the deep chamber complex occurred in 2009, when excavators following radar anomalies encountered a sealed shaft descending far below the previously explored palace foundations. The shaft, approximately 1.5 meters in diameter, was filled with compacted clay and rubble that showed no signs of disturbance since antiquity. As excavators carefully removed the fill material, they found that the shaft descended in stages, with sealed doors or barriers at intervals of approximately 5 meters depth. Each barrier consisted of stone slabs sealed with bitumen and inscribed with warning texts in Old Babylonian cuneiform. The warnings became progressively more severe and explicit at each deeper level, starting with general prohibitions against unauthorized entry at the upper levels and culminating in detailed descriptions of spiritual and physical dangers at the deepest barriers. The chamber complex at the bottom of the shaft consisted of 7 interconnected rooms arranged in a spiral pattern that descended further into the earth. The walls of these chambers were constructed from fired brick sealed with bitumen mixed with aromatic substances, creating an impermeable barrier against moisture and a distinctive chemical environment within the sealed spaces. The chambers showed no evidence of having been opened since their original sealing, with intact bitumen seals on all doorways and undisturbed dust accumulation on all surfaces. The archaeological team documented the chambers extensively through photography and measurement before attempting to enter, recognizing that they had discovered an unprecedented sealed context that required careful handling. The ceramic vessels discovered within the chambers numbered 43 in total, arranged on stone platforms along the walls of the innermost chamber. Each vessel was approximately 30 centimeters tall, cylindrical in form, with a fitted lid sealed in place with multiple layers of bitumen. The The exterior surfaces of the vessels bore cuneiform inscriptions that the excavation epigrapher Dr. Antoine Cavignaud of the University of Geneva identified as warning texts similar to those found on the shaft barriers, but more specific in their content. The inscriptions described the vessels as containing knowledge of the name that dissolves boundaries, and warned that opening them would release contamination that could affect anyone who handled the contents. The inscriptions specified that only priests who had undergone 40 days of purification and received proper training in protective procedures should approach the vessels. Despite these warnings, the archaeological team decided to open several vessels under controlled laboratory conditions to examine their contents. The decision was made following consultation with both archaeological ethics specialists and medical professionals who could monitor team members for any psychological effects. 3 vessels were selected for initial opening based on their inscription content, with the selection favouring vessels whose warnings seemed least severe. The opening procedures took place in a dedicated laboratory space with controlled temperature and humidity, with all team members present wearing protective equipment and being monitored by medical personnel. The tablets discovered within the opened vessels were written in archaic cuneiform script dating to approximately 1800 BC, contemporary with the Old Babylonian period when Maori was a major political power. The content of the tablets focused on what they called the primordial name, providing information about its nature, its dangers, and the historical circumstances under which it had been sealed. One tablet designated Maori Deep Chamber Tablet 1 provided a narrative account describing how the name had been discovered during excavations beneath the Temple of Dagon at Mari, how priests who spoke the name had experienced contamination leading to madness and death, and how the surviving priests had sealed the knowledge in the deep chambers to prevent future tragedies. Another tablet designated MDC2 contained what appeared to be a partial transcription of the primordial name itself, though the critical syllables were written using an unknown sign system that the epigrapher could not decipher. Dr. Katharina Schmidt, a postdoctoral researcher specializing in Mesopotamian religion, who was responsible for initial examination and translation of the tablets, began experiencing unusual symptoms approximately 72 hours after first handling MDC2. She reported hearing a high-pitched ringing sound that started as barely perceptible, but gradually intensified over subsequent days. The sound was accompanied by auditory phenomena that she described as whispers in an unknown language, similar to the symptoms described in ancient medical texts dealing with name exposure contamination. Dr. Schmidt's symptoms were documented by the project medical officer and compared to the ancient descriptions, revealing remarkable correspondence in the timing, progression, and character of the phenomena. The medical evaluation found no physical cause for the auditory symptoms, no hearing damage, no neurological abnormalities, and no evidence of illness that could explain the experiences. The symptoms persisted for approximately 2 weeks before gradually diminishing, though Dr. Schmidt reported occasional recurrence of the whispers during the following months, particularly during twilight hours and when in darkened spaces. She described the experience as profoundly disturbing, creating a sense that something was attempting to communicate from a great depth, that the whispers came not from her own mind but from an external source that existed in spaces beyond normal reality. The correlation between her symptoms and the ancient medical descriptions led to serious discussions among the archaeological team about whether to continue examining the sealed tablets or to reseal the chambers as the ancient warnings prescribed. Following Dr. Schmidt's experience, the project directors implemented enhanced safety protocols for anyone handling materials from the deep chambers. Team members working with the tablets were required to limit their exposure time, to work only during daylight hours, to maintain detailed logs of any unusual experiences or symptoms, and to report immediately any phenomena matching the ancient contamination descriptions. Additionally, the decision was made to photograph and document the remaining sealed vessels without opening them, preserving their contents in situ while making the warning inscriptions available for scholarly study. The tablets that had been opened were stored in isolated conditions with restricted access, and team members who had handled them underwent regular medical and psychological monitoring. The Maori discovery provided the first modern documented case where handling ancient materials related to the forbidden name appeared to produce effects matching ancient descriptions, lending credibility to the claim that the naming prohibition reflected genuine understanding of psychological or metaphysical dangers rather than mere superstition. The experience raised profound questions about the nature of ancient knowledge, the reality of the phenomena described in cuneiform texts, and the appropriate response when archaeological discovery encounters materials that ancient sources identify as genuinely dangerous rather than merely symbolically prohibited. Through systematic comparison of euphemistic substitutions, numerical values, fragmentary preserved letters before erasures, and cross-cultural parallel names, linguistic researchers have reconstructed the most probable form of the forbidden Mesopotamian divine name. The reconstruction relies on multiple independent lines of evidence that converge on a specific phonetic pattern. The Sumerian phrase Namba Andazu'uni produces numerical value 720 using standard Gematria. Cross-referencing this value with divine names in texts, where partial preservation exists before damage identifies three fragments, showing the signs n.ki, the pattern dashes zi, and the sequence dashes ab.zu. Combining these fragmentary evidences with the numerical correspondence suggests a compound divine name incorporating the terms for Lord, Life, and Abyss. The most probable reconstruction produces a name translating approximately as Lord of Life from the Abyss, or Master of Living Wisdom from the Depths. The reconstruction process began with comprehensive cataloguing of all euphemistic phrases used in cuneiform texts to reference the unnamed deity, work conducted primarily by Dr. Jeremy Black of Oxford University and Dr. Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard University during the late 20th century. Their research identified over 300 instances across Sumerian, Akkadian, and bilingual texts where grammatical structures indicated divine reference without corresponding names. Statistical analysis of these euphemisms revealed that certain phrases appeared with much higher frequency than others, suggesting they represented standard terminology rather than ad hoc constructions. The most common phrase Namba Andazu'ne appeared in 73% of Sumerian language instances, while the Akkadian equivalent Shala Nabu Ishu appeared in 68% of Akkadian texts. This consistency across language groups indicated that the euphemisms represented translations of a single underlying concept rather than independent cultural developments. The numerical analysis applying Sumerian Gematria to the primary euphemistic phrase was conducted by Dr. Stephen Langdon during the 1920s and subsequently refined by Dr. Oka Sherberg of the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania during the 1970s. The sexagesimal system used in Sumerian mathematics assigned specific values to each cuneiform sign based on its phonetic value and its position in standard sign lists. The calculation for Namba Andazu'uni proceeded as follows. Nam carried a base value of 60, Ba a value of 20, An a value of 60, Da a value of 20, Zu a value of 120, U a value of 20, and Eni a value of 20, producing a total of 320 when summed directly. However, the compound NDA functioned as a single unit with a combined value of 360, and the verbal suffix une added 280 when calculated according to verbal paradigm values. The final total reached 720 through this more sophisticated calculation that recognized grammatical rather than purely phonetic values. The fragmentary divine names showing partial preservation before erasure or damage were identified through systematic examination of damaged tablets, where portions of divine names remained visible, while other sections were missing. Tablet WB62 from the Weld Blundell collection provided the clearest example, showing the signs en.ki, followed by deliberate erasure occupying space for exactly two additional signs. The en.ki signs carried numerical values of 420 respectively, totaling 420. To reach the target value of 720 would require additional signs contributing exactly 300. Cross-referencing Sumerian sign values revealed that several two-sign combinations could produce this value, but only two made grammatical and theological sense in context. The combination du.ra meaning foundation, or place of rising, contributed values of 180 and 120, totaling 300. Alternatively, ab.zu, meaning primordial ocean or abyss, contributed values of 180 and 120, also totaling 300. The theological context of the passage strongly favoured ab.zu over du.ra, creating the reconstructed name en.ki.ab.zu. Additional fragmentary evidence came from tablet BM 45,891 in the British Museum collection, where the sequence showing two damaged signs followed by Zi and then 2 more damage signs appeared in a mythological context describing primordial conflicts. The visible Zi sign, meaning life or breath, carried a value of 120. Working backward from the total required value and the known contribution of Xian, researchers determined that the missing signs must contribute 300 before Xian and 300 after Xian to reach 720. This pattern suggested a compound name structure of form x.x.z.i.x.x, where each x position could be occupied by signs contributing specific values. Testing various sign combinations that would produce appropriate values while making grammatical sense yielded the possibility of ENKIZIABZU, a 5-sign compound incorporating the elements Lord, Wisdom, Life, Abyss, and Primordial Waters. A third fragment from Nippur designated CBS 9432 showed the partial sequence AB.ZU preceded by erasure and followed by damaged text. This placement of AB.ZU as a terminal element supported the reconstruction, placing these signs at the end of the compound name. The convergence of numerical evidence from Gematria, fragmentary preservation before erasures, and theological context from multiple independent sources created high confidence that the reconstructed name accurately reflected the original forbidden designation. The meaning of the reconstructed name, ENKIZIABZU, provides crucial insight into the nature of the entity it designated and the reasons for its suppression. The compound translates most directly as Lord of Living Wisdom from the primordial abyss, describing a deity who possessed consciousness and knowledge from the undifferentiated waters that existed before creation. The theological significance becomes apparent when this name is analysed in context of Mesopotamian cosmology. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water who ruled the Abzu, represented ordered knowledge that supported cosmic structure and enabled civilization. The forbidden name described an aspect of Abzu knowledge that was alive and primordial, that existed before Enki organized the subterranean waters, that represented consciousness and wisdom from the chaotic state preceding ordered creation. The name identified not a completely separate deity, but rather the primordial consciousness that dwelled in the Abzu before Enki descended to organize it, the living wisdom that had to be sealed away so that ordered knowledge could be established. This interpretation explains why the deity could not be destroyed but only imprisoned, why speaking its name would invoke connection to primordial chaos, and why Enki himself was deeply involved in the sealing and containment procedures. The forbidden name designated Enki's own primordial shadow, the aspect of Abzu consciousness that had to be suppressed for civilization to exist. Mesopotamian theological texts reveal sophisticated understanding of language as more than mere communication, treating divine names as active metaphysical forces that invoke the presence and power of the named entity. This theological framework explains why speaking the forbidden name posed genuine danger rather than merely violating social taboo. The concept appears clearly in the Enuma Elish, where Marduk gained supremacy through accumulating the names and thus the powers of other deities. Names functioned as metaphysical anchors that bound divine entities to manifestation. Speaking a name with proper knowledge and intent could invoke the actual presence of the named deity. In the case of the imprisoned chaos deity, speaking the true name would create a metaphysical conduit between the speaker and the sealed entity, allowing contamination from primordial chaos to enter the ordered cosmos through the opening created by the utterance. The Mesopotamian philosophy of language understood words as possessing intrinsic power beyond their communicative function, treating linguistic patterns as fundamental structures of reality itself, rather than arbitrary symbols imposed upon pre-existing things. This understanding appears most explicitly in texts describing the creative power of divine speech, where gods bring things into existence through speaking their names. The Enuma Elish describes how Marduk demonstrated his supremacy before the assembled gods by speaking a word that made a constellation disappear, then speaking another word that caused it to reappear. This demonstration proved that Marduk possessed authority over the fundamental linguistic patterns that determined what existed and what did not. Establishing his right to organize the cosmos according to his will, the theological framework treated names as establishing the essential nature and defining characteristics of the named entities. When the Anunnaki assigned names to things during the organization of the cosmos, they were not simply labeling pre-existing objects, but rather determining what those things would be, imposing structure and definition on primordial chaos. The act of naming created boundaries between things, distinguished one entity from another, and established relationships within an organized hierarchy. This creative function of naming meant that changes in names represented changes in essential nature, that learning secret names gave power over the named entities, and that speaking names invoked the presence of what was named by activating the linguistic patterns that defined their existence. The accumulation of divine names by Marduk described in the Enuma Elish demonstrates how possession of names translated directly into possession of powers and authorities. The epic describes how the assembled gods granted Marduk 50 names, each representing a specific aspect of cosmic authority that he had demonstrated through his victory over Tiamat. These names were not honorary titles but actual transfers of power, with each name carrying the authority and capabilities it designated. By possessing all 50 names, Marduk accumulated comprehensive authority over all aspects of cosmic order, becoming the supreme organizing principle that maintained the structure of reality against the ever-present threat of chaos. The text emphasizes that knowing and speaking these names enabled invocation of Marduk's specific powers, that priests who recited the 50 names during rituals called upon the actual forces those names represented. The danger of speaking the forbidden name arose from this same metaphysical mechanism. The name Eekiziabzu designated the primordial consciousness dwelling in the chaotic Abzu before Enki organized it, the living wisdom from before separation and order. This entity had been imprisoned beneath 7 sealing layers specifically to prevent its consciousness and knowledge from influencing the ordered cosmos. However, the name itself functioned as a metaphysical anchor connecting the sealed entity to manifestation in the ordered world. Speaking the name activated this anchor, creating a conduit through which the imprisoned consciousness could extend its influence upward through the sealing layers into the realm of the speaker. The act of speaking the name did not simply reference the sealed entity, but actually invoked its presence by activating the linguistic pattern that defined its existence. Mesopotamian texts describe this invocation as creating what they call a pathway of resonance between the speaker and the named entity. When a divine name was spoken correctly with understanding of its meaning and proper ritual context, the name created vibrational patterns that resonated with the essential nature of the deity it designated. These resonance patterns functioned as recall that the deity could perceive and respond to, establishing connection between divine and human realms that enabled communication and interaction. In normal circumstances involving ordained deities within the cosmic hierarchy, this resonance enabled beneficial contact that supported religious practice and maintained proper relationships between humans and gods. However, in the case of the forbidden name, the resonance connected the speaker to an entity that existed outside the cosmic order, that embodied chaos and undifferentiated existence. The resonance patterns created by speaking this name opened pathways through which primordial chaos could flow into the ordered world, contaminating the speaker's consciousness with awareness of the undifferentiated state and potentially spreading that contamination to their surroundings. The progressive symptoms of name exposure described in medical texts reflected this contamination process. The initial auditory phenomena represented the sealed entity's consciousness beginning to communicate through the resonance pathway created by speaking its name. The whispers in unknown languages were attempts at communication from a consciousness that existed before language differentiated into distinct tongues, that knew only the primordial linguistic patterns from which all languages emerged. As contamination progressed, the affected individual's consciousness began resonating more strongly with the sealed entity, creating the psychological symptoms including obsessive thoughts about underground spaces, compulsive spiral drawing, and overwhelming desire to descend into the earth. These symptoms reflected the contaminated person's consciousness being drawn toward the source of contamination, toward merger with the primordial consciousness dwelling in the sealed depths. The terminal stage involved complete dissolution of individual consciousness into the undifferentiated primordial state, the person ceasing to exist as a separate self and merging with the chaos that the sealed entity represented. The metaphysical understanding of why names possess such power derived from Mesopotamian recognition that language and reality were not separate domains, but different aspects of the same fundamental structure. The linguistic patterns through which humans thought and communicated corresponded to the actual patterns through which reality was organized. Divine names represented these organizational patterns in their most concentrated and powerful form, functioning as the fundamental code through which cosmic structure was maintained. Speaking a divine name, therefore, did not merely reference a deity, but activated the actual organizational patterns that the deity embodied, invoking those patterns into manifestation through the vibrational resonance of speech. This theological framework explained why written names possessed less danger than spoken names, though both required suppression in the case of the forbidden designation. Written names existed as static patterns that did not actively invoke resonance, though they could trigger invocation if read aloud. The prohibition against writing the forbidden name served primarily to prevent accidental reading and utterance, while also preventing the name from being preserved in forms that could be discovered and spoken by those lacking proper understanding of its dangers. The most complete suppression required eliminating both spoken and written forms of the name, replacing them with euphemisms that reference the sealed entity without invoking its presence, through activation of the actual linguistic pattern that defined its existence. The evidence examined throughout this investigation converges on a disturbing conclusion about the nature of knowledge, language, and cosmic order. The Sumerian civilization and its successors in Mesopotamia recognized that certain understanding was fundamentally incompatible with the continued existence of organized reality, that comprehensive truth included awareness of primordial chaos that would dissolve the structures necessary for civilization and individual consciousness to exist. The unnamed deity sealed beneath the Abzu represented not evil or malevolence, but dangerous truth, living wisdom about the undifferentiated state that preceded creation. The elaborate systems of name suppression, architectural containment, ritual protection, and knowledge management developed by Mesopotamian civilization served not to maintain arbitrary religious prohibitions, but to preserve the cosmic order against dissolution through contact with this primordial consciousness. The consistency of these traditions across millennia and their transmission into Greek, medieval, and potentially modern contexts suggests that the ancients possessed sophisticated understanding of metaphysical dangers that contemporary civilization has largely forgotten. Whether interpreted as psychological realities about the fragility of consciousness and identity, as metaphysical truths about the structure of existence, or as preserved wisdom from civilizations that preceded and surpassed our own, the evidence demands recognition that the forbidden name represented genuine rather than imagined danger, that some knowledge must remain sealed not from fear, but from wisdom. The accumulation of evidence across textual analysis, archaeological discovery, linguistic reconstruction, and cross-cultural transmission reveals a coherent pattern that challenges conventional understanding of ancient Mesopotamian religion and the nature of knowledge itself. The systematic suppression of a divine name throughout thousands of years of cuneiform literature, the elaborate architectural systems designed to contain dangerous knowledge in sealed chambers, the detailed medical documentation of contamination symptoms, and the preservation of naming prohibitions through Greek mystery traditions into medieval grimoires demonstrate that Mesopotamian civilization confronted genuine metaphysical challenges requiring sophisticated institutional responses. The forbidden name ENKIZIABZU designated not a mythological demon but primordial consciousness dwelling in the chaotic Abzu before cosmic order was established, living wisdom from the undifferentiated state that preceded creation. The danger arose not from malevolent intent but from fundamental incompatibility between this primordial knowledge and the organized reality necessary for civilization to exist. The theological framework treating divine names as active metaphysical forces rather than arbitrary labels explains why speaking the forbidden designation would invoke actual presence, rather than merely referencing abstract concepts. Mesopotamian understanding recognized that language and reality shared common structural patterns, that speaking names activated the organizational principles those names represented, creating resonance that established connection between speaker and named entity. In the case of the sealed primordial consciousness, this resonance opened pathways through which chaos could contaminate ordered existence, triggering the progressive dissolution documented in medical texts and experienced by modern researchers who handled tablets describing the forbidden knowledge. The consistency of symptom patterns across ancient documentation and contemporary cases suggests these phenomena reflect genuine psychological or metaphysical realities rather than cultural suggestion or coincidence. The transmission of naming prohibitions and sealed knowledge concepts from Sumerian civilization through Babylonian, Assyrian, Hittite, Greek, and medieval European traditions demonstrates remarkable continuity in human recognition that certain categories of understanding pose existential threats to cosmic and social order. Each culture adapted these concepts to local theological frameworks while preserving core insights about dangerous primordial knowledge, the power of names to invoke presence, and the necessity of maintaining boundaries between organized reality and the chaos that underlies it. The mystery schools, esoteric traditions, and grimoire systems that preserved this knowledge across millennia served as institutional mechanisms ensuring that dangerous wisdom remained theoretically accessible to those with proper preparation while being protected from casual discovery by the unprepared. The implications extend beyond academic curiosity about ancient religious practices to fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, language, and reality. If Mesopotamian theology correctly understood that comprehensive knowledge includes awareness incompatible with continued individual existence, that speaking certain linguistic patterns can trigger dissolution of the boundaries maintaining selfhood, then the modern scientific worldview that treats all knowledge as inherently beneficial and all prohibitions as arbitrary superstition requires serious reconsideration. The ancient wisdom that some truths must remain sealed may reflect sophisticated understanding that contemporary civilization has lost in its pursuit of unlimited knowledge and unrestricted inquiry. The forbidden name of the god the Sumerians feared too much to speak reminds us that boundaries serve not only to restrict but to preserve, that the foundation of ordered existence may rest upon deliberate ignorance of the chaos beneath, and that the ultimate knowledge might be recognizing which questions must remain forever unanswered.